The Anunnaki emerge from the earliest strands of Mesopotamian religious consciousness as fundamental forces governing the cosmic order between heaven and earth. Their presence permeates the oldest surviving cuneiform texts from southern Mesopotamia, where Sumerian scribes first committed their theological understanding to clay tablets around 3200 BCE. These deities represented far more than simple anthropomorphic gods. They embodied the very structure of reality itself, serving as the divine architects who established the boundaries between the celestial realm and terrestrial existence. The term Anunnaki derives from the Sumerian Inanna, literally meaning offspring of En, or those of En's lineage, and also rendered as Anu in later Akkadian sources, stood as the supreme sky god whose domain encompassed the highest heavens. The suffix Enki denotes earth or land, creating a compound that fundamentally describes deities whose authority spans from the celestial sphere to the earthly realm. This linguistic construction reveals the Sumerian conception of divine hierarchy, where the Anunnaki functioned as intermediaries between the unreachable cosmic heights and the tangible world of human experience. Proto-Sumerian theological development shows the gradual crystallization of Anunnaki identity through successive generations of religious texts. The earliest references appear in administrative documents from Uruk and Uar, where temple inventories mention offerings dedicated to the Inanna who judge and the great Inanna of heaven and earth. These fragmentary mentions suggest that by 3000 BCE, the concept of a collective divine assembly had already taken root in Sumerian religious practice. The Sumerian king list, compiled during the third dynasty of Uar around 2100 BCE but incorporating much older traditions, provides crucial evidence for understanding Anunnaki origins. The text begins with a famous declaration that kingship descended from heaven, establishing the fundamental principle that earthly authority derives from divine mandate. The list's antediluvian section describes rulers whose reigns spanned impossibly long periods. Alullim of Eridu ruled for 28,800 years, while Enmenluana of Bad Tibra governed for 43,200 years. These astronomical numbers reflect Sumerian understanding of cosmic timescales and suggest that early kingship operated under direct Anunnaki supervision. Archaeological evidence from Eridu, traditionally regarded as the first city, reveals the physical context within which Anunnaki worship developed. Excavations have uncovered 17 successive temple levels dating from approximately 5000 BCE, with the earlier structures showing sophisticated architectural planning that would become characteristic of Mesopotamian religious complexes. The temple's orientation toward cardinal directions and its elevated platform design reflect cosmological principles that later texts explicitly associate with Anunnaki divine architecture. The creation myths preserved at Eridu present the Anunnaki as active participants in world formation, rather than distant observers. The Eridu Genesis, known from Old Babylonian copies but reflecting much older Sumerian traditions, describes how the Anunnaki established the first cities and appointed kings to govern humanity. The text states that after the gods had created mankind, the Anunnaki, the great gods, held assembly and assigned the destinies. This passage demonstrates the collective nature of Anunnaki decision-making and their role as cosmic legislators. Nippur's religious archives provide additional insight into Anunnaki theological development through the lens of Enlil worship. As the city that housed Mesopotamia's most important religious sanctuary, Nippur preserved traditions that illuminate the relationship between individual deities and the larger Anunnaki collective. The Tumul inscription, dating to the Urva III period, describes how successive rulers restored Enlil's temple for the Anunnaki who decree fate, indicating that even supreme deities like Enlil operated within the broader framework of Anunnaki authority. Cuneiform sources from Nippur also preserve the earliest versions of texts that would later become part of the Mesopotamian literary canon. The composition known as Enlil and Ninlil contains detailed descriptions of divine councils, where the Anunnaki deliberate on matters affecting both gods and mortals. These assemblies take place in the Upshukina, a cosmic chamber where the gods gather to determine destinies. The text describes how 50 great Anunnaki and 7 Anunnaki who decree fate participate in these deliberations, establishing numerical frameworks that would persist throughout Mesopotamian religious tradition. The distinction between Anunnaki and other divine categories becomes apparent through careful analysis of theological terminology. The Igigi, whose name derives from a root meaning to see or to watch, represented a separate class of deities associated with celestial observation and astronomical phenomena. While the Anunnaki governed fundamental cosmic principles, the Igigi served more specialized functions related to divination and the interpretation of heavenly signs. Sumerian texts consistently maintain this distinction, with the Igigi appearing as subordinate to the Anunnaki in matters of ultimate authority. The 7 who decree fate constituted another distinct divine category. Though one closely associated with the Anunnaki hierarchy, these 7 deities possessed specific responsibility for determining individual and collective destinies, operating as an executive council within the larger Anunnaki assembly. The number 7 held particular significance in Mesopotamian cosmology, reflecting the 7 visible planets and the 7-day week that structured both divine and human temporal experience. Linguistic analysis reveals the evolution of Anunnaki terminology across different periods and regions of Mesopotamia. Early Sumerian texts employ various spellings and grammatical constructions that suggest dialectical variations in how different city-states understood these deities. The Pharaoh period texts show standardization beginning to emerge as political unification created pressure for theological consistency across Sumerian territories. The relationship between Anunnaki and cosmic geography becomes evident through examination of temple architecture and ritual practice. Ziggurats, the massive step towers that dominated Mesopotamian cities, served as physical representations of the cosmic mountain where heaven and earth intersected. These structures provided platforms for Anunnaki worship and symbolized the divine hierarchy through their ascending levels. The Anu ziggurat at Uruk, dedicated to the father of the Anunnaki, exemplifies this architectural theology through its imposing height and careful astronomical alignments. Religious calendars preserved in cuneiform archives demonstrate how Anunnaki worship structured the annual cycle of festivals and observances. The Akita celebration, documented from the earliest Sumerian periods through the end of Mesopotamian civilization, centered on the renewal of divine kingship through Anunnaki approval. During this festival, the reigning monarch underwent ritual procedures that symbolically recreated the original divine appointment of earthly rulers. The economic dimensions of Anunnaki worship emerge clearly from temple administrative records. These institutions controlled vast agricultural estates, craft workshops, and trade networks that generated the wealth necessary to support elaborate ritual cycles. The Drahem Archive, dating to the Earth III period, records thousands of animals sacrificed to various Anunnaki throughout the year, indicating the massive scale of resources devoted to maintaining divine favor. Iconographic evidence from cylinder seals and temple reliefs provides visual documentation of how Mesopotamians conceived Anunnaki appearance and attributes. These deities typically appear wearing horned crowns that signify divine status, with the number of horned pairs indicating relative rank within the celestial hierarchy. Their garments show the elaborate textiles associated with royal authority, while their poses convey the dignified bearing appropriate to cosmic rulers. The integration of Anunnaki theology with practical governance becomes apparent through analysis of law codes and administrative documents. The Code of Urnamu, the earliest known legal compilation, begins with the declaration that the king received his authority from Anu and Enlil, establishing the principle that earthly justice derives from divine mandate. This legal framework positioned the Anunnaki as ultimate guarantors of social order and moral behavior. The administrative complexity of Anunnaki governance crystallized around three supreme deities whose complementary domains established the fundamental structure of cosmic authority. Anu, Enlil, and Enki formed what Babylonian theologians termed the triad of great gods, each controlling essential aspects of universal order while maintaining collective responsibility for major decisions affecting both divine and mortal realms. This triumvirate system emerged from earlier Sumerian traditions but achieved its most sophisticated expression during the Old Babylonian period, when scribes at Babylon, Sippah, and Nippah codified the relationships between the supreme powers. Anu's position as Skyfather placed him at the apex of divine hierarchy, though his authority operated through delegation rather than direct intervention. Cuneiform texts consistently describe him as dwelling in the highest heaven, removed from daily administration but serving as final arbiter in disputes between lesser deities. The Babylonian creation Epic Enuma Elish portrays Anu as possessing the Anu power, a cosmic force that could be transferred to other gods during moments of crisis. When Tiamat threatened the established order, Anu attempted to confront the primordial chaos goddess but found his authority insufficient, ultimately passing his power to Mardukka for the decisive battle. This narrative demonstrates how Anu's supremacy operated through institutional frameworks rather than personal combat prowess. Temple records from Uruk reveal the practical manifestations of Anu's authority through elaborate ritual cycles that reinforced his cosmic kingship. The Anu temple complex, rebuilt multiple times throughout Mesopotamian history, featured a distinctive architectural program that emphasized vertical ascension toward the divine realm. Priests ascending the ziggurat's multiple levels symbolically traversed the cosmic hierarchy, with each platform representing a different sphere of divine authority. The temple's sacred marriage chamber at its summit provided the setting for annual rituals that renewed Anu's cosmic sovereignty through union with Inanna, the goddess of love and war. Enlil's dominion over atmospheric phenomena and terrestrial authority positioned him as the most actively involved member of the divine triad in earthly affairs. Babylonian sources consistently identify him as Lord of the Hurricane and King of the Lands, titles that reflected his control over both natural forces and political structures. The Nippur Temple archives preserve detailed accounts of how Enlil's priests interpreted meteorological events as expressions of divine will, with storms, floods, and droughts serving as communication from the god to his human subjects. These interpretations carried significant political weight, as rulers throughout Mesopotamia sought Enlil's approval for military campaigns, legal reforms, and major construction projects. The Code of Hammurabi provides concrete evidence of Enlil's role in legitimizing royal authority. The Law Code's prologue declares that Anu and Enlil appointed Hammurabi to cause justice to prevail in the land, establishing the legal principle that earthly rulers derive their authority from divine mandate. This concept of divinely sanctioned kingship required constant renewal through ritual observances at Enlil's Nippur sanctuary, where kings from across Mesopotamia traveled to receive formal recognition of their legitimacy. The Tumul Chronicle records multiple instances of rulers who lost divine favor after neglecting their obligations to Enlil's temple, resulting in military defeats and political instability. Enlil's authority extended beyond political legitimation to encompass the fundamental forces that sustained agricultural civilization. Sumerian hymns describe him as Lord of Abundance, who controlled the flooding of rivers, the fertility of soil, and the productivity of livestock. The Farmer's Almanac, a practical agricultural manual preserved in multiple copies, begins with prayers to Enlil requesting favorable weather conditions for planting and harvesting. These texts demonstrate how theological concepts translated into practical guidance for the agricultural activities that supported Mesopotamian urban centers. Enki's sphere of influence encompassed both the freshwater sources essential for irrigation agriculture and the intellectual capacities that enabled human civilization. Babylonian mythology consistently portrays him as humanity's patron and protector, the deity who provided the knowledge and skills necessary for urban life. The Atrahasis epic describes how Enki secretly warned the flood hero of impending destruction, defying the other gods' decision to eliminate humanity through catastrophic deluge. This narrative establishes Enki as a mediating figure between divine authority and human welfare, a role that distinguished him from his more distant colleagues in the Supreme Triad. The Eridu Temple complex, dedicated to Enki worship, served as Mesopotamia's most important center for scholarly and technical education. Archaeological evidence reveals extensive scribal schools, workshops for craftsmen, and laboratories where priests conducted early forms of chemical and medical experimentation. The temple's library contained comprehensive collections of technical manuals covering irrigation engineering, metallurgy, textile production, and pharmaceutical preparation. These practical applications of divine wisdom demonstrated how Enki's theological role translated into concrete benefits for human society. Enki's association with the Abzu, the freshwater ocean beneath the earth, connected him to the hydrological systems that made Mesopotamian agriculture possible. Sumerian hymns describe him as Lord of the Flowing Water, who directed the underground streams that fed rivers, canals, and wells. The Enki and Ninhursag myth provides detailed accounts of how the god established irrigation networks and taught humans the techniques necessary for managing water resources. These narratives served both theological and practical purposes, preserving technical knowledge within religious frameworks that ensured its transmission across generations. The assembly of great gods functioned as a divine legislature that deliberated on affecting cosmic order and human civilization. Babylonian sources describe this assembly as comprising 50 Anunnaki, who gathered in the Upsakina, a cosmic chamber located in Enlil's Nippur sanctuary. The assembly's proceedings followed formal protocols that paralleled earthly legal institutions, with designated speakers presenting cases, witnesses providing testimony, and judges rendering verdicts based on established precedents. The Epic of Gilgamesh preserves detailed descriptions of these divine deliberations, particularly the assembly's decision to punish Gilgamesh and Enkidu for killing the bull of heaven and Humbaba. Administrative roles within the divine assembly reflected specialized areas of cosmic responsibility. Ninhursag, the mother goddess, oversaw matters related to childbirth, fertility, and the continuation of species. Her authority extended to both divine and mortal reproduction, with texts describing how she shaped the first humans from clay and established the biological processes that govern population growth. The Enki and Ninhursag composition details her in creating various life forms and establishing the natural cycles that sustained ecological balance. Inanna, the moon god, controlled temporal measurement and the calendar systems that structured both religious and secular activities. Babylonian astronomical texts describe his movement through the heavens as providing the fundamental rhythm for agricultural, commercial, and ritual cycles. His temple at Ur housed sophisticated astronomical observation facilities, where priests tracked lunar phases and calculated the complex intercalations necessary to maintain calendar accuracy. These calculations required advanced mathematical skills and represented one of Mesopotamian civilization's most significant intellectual achievements. Utu, the sun god, administered justice and served as divine witness to oaths and contracts. His daily journey across the sky positioned him as the ideal observer of human behavior, able to see all actions performed under his light. Legal documents frequently invoke Utu as guarantor of contractual obligations, with oathbreakers facing divine punishment in the form of disease, poverty, or social disgrace. The Code of Hammurabi depicts Utu presenting the law symbols to the king, establishing the principle that earthly justice reflected cosmic moral order. Genealogical relationships within the Anunnaki pantheon created complex networks of authority and obligation that influenced divine decision-making. Marduk's status as Enki's son positioned him as heir to his father's wisdom, while establishing his claim to supreme authority in Babylonian theology. The Enuma Elish describes Marduk's gradual accumulation of power through successful completion of increasingly difficult challenges, culminating in his victory over Tiamat and appointment as king of the gods. This narrative served both theological and political purposes, legitimizing Babylon's rise to regional dominance, while explaining the transfer of supreme authority from older Sumerian deities to their Babylonian successors. The relationship between Enlil and his sons Inanna and Ninurta created another significant power block within the divine hierarchy. Inanna's control over temporal cycles complemented his father's authority over terrestrial affairs, while Ninurta's as divine warrior provided military support for Enlil's political decisions. The Ninurta myths describe extensive campaigns against various monsters and rebels, with the gods' victors serving to maintain cosmic order against chaotic forces. These narratives emphasize the importance of divine military power in preserving the established hierarchy against internal and external threats. Marriage relationships among the Anunnaki created additional bonds that influenced divine politics. Inanna's union with Ningal produced Utu and Inanna, creating a lunar-solar dynasty that controlled both temporal measurement and justice administration. Inanna's marriage to Dumuzi, though ending tragically with his death and descent to the underworld, established important connections between the celestial gods and the powers governing the realm of the dead. These mythological relationships provided theological explanations for natural phenomena while creating narrative frameworks that preserved important cultural values. The concept of divine assembly decision-making processes appears most clearly in epic literature, where major plot developments result from formal deliberations among the gods. The Atrahasis epic describes the assembly's decision to reduce human population through plague, famine, and finally flood, with each measure requiring formal debate and majority approval. Enki's opposition to these measures creates dramatic tension, while illustrating how individual gods could challenge collective decisions through procedural means rather than direct confrontation. The Gilgamesh epic provides another detailed example of divine assembly procedures in its account of the gods' response to Gilgamesh's killing of Humbaba and the Bull of Heaven. The assembly must determine appropriate punishment for these acts of defiance against divine authority, with various gods presenting arguments for different penalties. The final decision to condemn Enki due to death represents a compromise that satisfies demands for justice while avoiding direct confrontation with Gilgamesh's divine protectors. These assembly procedures reflected sophisticated understanding of collective decision-making that paralleled developments in human political institutions. The requirement for formal debate, presentation of evidence, and majority approval created checks against arbitrary divine action, while ensuring that major decisions reflected broad consensus among the cosmic powers. This procedural complexity distinguished Mesopotamian theology from simpler systems where supreme deities exercised unconstrained authority over both divine and mortal realms. The theological framework established by the Anunnaki pantheon found its most profound expression in creation narratives that positioned humanity as divinely crafted laborers designed to serve the gods' earthly needs. The Atrahasis epic, preserved in multiple versions spanning from Old Babylonian to Neo-Assyrian periods, presents the most comprehensive account of humanity's origins within Anunnaki cosmology. This composition, whose title derives from its flood hero's name meaning exceedingly wise, describes how the gods created humans to resolve a divine labor crisis that threatened the stability of cosmic order. The epic's opening passages established the fundamental problem that necessitated human creation. The Igigi gods, responsible for maintaining the gods' earthly estates, had grown weary of their endless toil. For 40 years these lesser deities excavated canals, built temples, and performed the agricultural work necessary to sustain divine civilization. Their rebellion began with work stoppages and protests, escalating to open defiance when they burned their tools and surrounded Enlil's residence in Nippur. The text describes how the Igigi carried fire. They filled their tools with fire, fire to the hoe, flame to the mattock, creating a crisis that demanded immediate resolution from the supreme Anunnaki. Enlil's initial response involved summoning the divine assembly to address this unprecedented challenge to cosmic authority. The god's alarm at finding armed rebels at his doorstep reflects the serious nature of the threat posed by divine labor unrest. The assembly deliberations, conducted in the Ubzakina chamber, required careful consideration of how to maintain essential work while addressing legitimate grievances from the Igigi. The solution proposed by Enki demonstrated his characteristic wisdom and concern for practical problem-solving. Create a new category of beings specifically designed for labor, thereby freeing the Igigi from their burdensome duties while ensuring continued productivity. The actual process of human creation involved sophisticated theological concepts that reveal Mesopotamian understanding of the relationship between divine and mortal existence. Enki's plan required the sacrifice of Wiilu, described as a god who has intelligence, whose blood would provide the essential divine component for human nature. This sacrifice took place during the new moon, when cosmic forces aligned favorably for creation activities. The text specifies that Nintu, the birth goddess, mixed the slain god's blood with clay to form the basic human substance, with the divine blood providing intelligence and the clay contributing physical form. The creation process involved 14 birth goddesses, each responsible for producing one male and one female human. This multiplication through divine midwifery ensured genetic diversity while establishing the reproductive capacity necessary for human population growth. The text describes how these goddesses pinched off 14 pieces of clay and shaped them into human forms through a process that took 10 months, paralleling normal gestation periods. The resulting humans possessed sufficient intelligence to understand divine commands while lacking the power to challenge their creator's authority. Enki's intervention in human creation carried profound theological implications that distinguished him from other Anunnaki and established his role as humanity's divine patron. His decision to provide humans with divine intelligence, despite knowing this gift would eventually lead to problems, demonstrated a complex understanding of the relationship between wisdom and suffering. The gods' secret addition of extra-divine essence to human nature, beyond what the assembly had authorized, represented an act of divine rebellion that would have far-reaching consequences for both gods and mortals. This theological tension between collective divine authority and individual divine conscience appears throughout Mesopotamian literature as a recurring theme. Enki's willingness to defy assembly decisions when they conflicted with his personal ethics established precedents for divine dissent that would later manifest in his protection of humanity during the flood. The gods' actions raised fundamental questions about the nature of divine authority and the extent to which individual gods could pursue independent policies that contradicted collective decisions. Yatra's epic's treatment of human creation also addressed practical concerns about the relationship between divine and human labor. The text specifies that humans would bear the load of the gods, taking over the agricultural and construction work that had previously burdened the Igigi. This arrangement created a three-tiered cosmic hierarchy, with the great Anunnaki at the top, the Igigi serving as middle management, and humans performing manual labor at the bottom. The system's efficiency depended on maintaining clear boundaries between these categories, while ensuring adequate compensation for each level's contributions. The Epic of Gilgamesh provides additional perspectives on human creation that complement and sometimes contradict the Yatra's account. In this composition, the goddess Ururu creates Enkidu from clay in response to prayers requesting a companion for Gilgamesh. The creation process involves the goddess washing her hands, pinching off clay, and casting it onto the step, where it takes the form of a wild man covered with hair. This more spontaneous creation method contrasts with the elaborate assembly procedures described in Atrahasis, suggesting different theological traditions about the mechanisms of divine creativity. Enkidu's initial state as a wild man who lives among animals and drinks from streams represents humanity's original condition before civilization. His transformation through contact with a temple prostitute who teaches him human customs illustrates the process by which divine wisdom civilizes natural human instincts. The 7 days and nights of sexual instruction that humanize Enkidu parallel creation narratives in which divine knowledge transforms raw human material into civilized beings capable of urban life. The Enuma Elish presents yet another perspective on human origins that emphasizes Marduk's role as creator god following his victory over Tiamat. In this version, Marduk proposes creating humans to serve the gods after establishing cosmic order through his defeat of primordial chaos. The epic describes how Ea suggested using Kingu's blood, since this rebel god bore primary responsibility for organizing resistance against the younger generation of deities. The creation process involves mixing Kingu's blood with clay to produce humans who will bear the service of the gods that they might be at ease. This version's emphasis on using a rebel god's blood for human creation carries different theological implications than the Atrahasis account. Rather than sacrificing a god with intelligence, the Enuma Elish uses the blood of a defeated enemy, suggesting that human nature contains elements of both divine wisdom and rebellious tendencies. This duality explains humanity's capacity for both great achievements and destructive behavior, providing theological justification for the moral complexity that characterizes human civilization. Comparative analysis of these creation accounts reveals significant variations in how different Mesopotamian traditions understood humanity's relationship to the divine realm. The Atrahasis epic emphasizes humanity's role as divinely created laborers whose primary purpose involves serving the gods' material needs. The Gilgamesh tradition focuses more on the civilizing process that transforms natural humans into urban dwellers capable of sophisticated cultural achievements. The Enuma Elish presents human creation as part of Marduk's broader program of cosmic organization, following his assumption of supreme divine authority. These variations reflect different regional and temporal perspectives on fundamental theological questions about human nature and destiny. Sumerian traditions, preserved most clearly in the Atrahasis epic, emphasized humanity's subordinate status and obligation to serve divine needs. Later Babylonian compositions showed greater interest in human potential for wisdom and cultural achievement, while maintaining the basic framework of divine superiority. Assyrian versions often stressed the importance of royal authority as divine representation on earth, connecting human creation to political legitimacy. The concept of divine image appears in various forms throughout these creation narratives, though its precise meaning remains subject to theological debate throughout Mesopotamian history. The term literally means statue or representation, suggesting that humans functioned as physical manifestations of divine presence in the earthly realm. This interpretation positioned humanity as living icons that made divine authority visible and accessible to mortal perception, similar to how temple statues served as focal points for divine worship. Alternative interpretations of Salmu emphasized functional rather than physical resemblance between gods and humans. According to this understanding, humans bore divine image through their capacity for rational thought, moral decision-making, and creative activity rather than through physical appearance. This functional interpretation explained how humans could serve as divine representatives while remaining clearly subordinate to their creators in power and authority. The theological debate over divine image carried practical implications for how Mesopotamian societies understood human rights and responsibilities. If humans bore divine image through rational capacity, then educational and intellectual development represented religious obligations that honored the gods who provided these gifts. If divine image involved physical resemblance, then proper care for human bodies and respect for human dignity became forms of divine worship that acknowledged the gods' creative power. Legal codes throughout Mesopotamian history reflected these theological concepts through provisions that protected human life and dignity, while maintaining clear distinctions between social classes. The Code of Hammurabi's graduated penalties for crimes against persons of different social status demonstrated how divine image concepts interacted with practical social hierarchies. Free citizens received greater protection than slaves, but even slaves possessed certain rights that acknowledged their participation in divine nature through human form. Temple records document elaborate rituals designed to honor the gods for their gift of human creation, while acknowledging humanity's ongoing obligations to divine authority. New Year festivals included ceremonies that symbolically reenacted human creation, with priests molding clay figures while reciting appropriate incantations. These rituals served educational and devotional purposes, teaching participants about their origins while reinforcing their obligations to serve divine needs through temple support and moral behavior. The economic implications of creation theology appear clearly in temple administrative documents that detail the vast resources devoted to maintaining divine service. Thousands of workers labored in temple fields, workshops, and construction projects that sustained elaborate ritual cycles honoring the creator gods. These economic arrangements translated theological concepts about human purpose into practical systems that organized large-scale productive activities around religious obligations. Medical texts preserve additional evidence of how creation theology influenced practical understanding of human nature and health. Mesopotamian physicians understood disease as resulting from divine displeasure or demonic interference with the gods' creative work. Treatment protocols typically combined practical remedies with ritual procedures designed to restore proper relationships between patients and their divine creators. This holistic approach reflected theological understanding of humans as composite beings whose physical and spiritual components required integrated care. The preservation of creation narratives across multiple millennia demonstrates their fundamental importance for Mesopotamian cultural identity and religious practice. Scribes continuously copied, edited, and reinterpreted these texts to address changing political and social conditions, while maintaining core theological principles about humanity's divine origins and ongoing obligations. This textual tradition provided stability and continuity that helped Mesopotamian civilization maintain coherent cultural identity despite frequent political upheavals and foreign conquests. The theological tensions inherent in humanity's creation as divine laborers inevitably led to conflicts that would culminate in the most catastrophic decision recorded in Mesopotamian literature: the Anunnaki's collective determination to destroy their human creations through a devastating flood. The Atrahasis epic provides the most detailed account of the circumstances that precipitated this divine judgment, describing how human population growth and cultural development created unforeseen problems that challenged the cosmic order the gods had established. Within 600 years of human creation, the earth had become densely populated with thriving communities that generated constant noise and activity. The cuneiform text describes how the land bellowed like a bull and the god grew restless at their clamor. This disturbance proved particularly troublesome for Enlil, whose authority over terrestrial affairs made him directly responsible for maintaining order among human populations. The god's complaints focused not merely on noise levels, but on humanity's increasing independence from direct divine supervision as growing populations developed their own social institutions and cultural practices that operated with minimal reference to divine authority. Archaeological evidence from sites like Teleson and Chagamami supports the epic's portrayal of rapid population growth during the 6th millennium BCE, when improved agricultural techniques and irrigation systems enabled larger settlements to sustain themselves throughout seasonal variations. These communities developed sophisticated craft specialization, long-distance trade networks, and administrative systems that reduced their dependence on temple institutions for economic coordination. The resulting cultural autonomy represented a significant departure from the original divine plan, which had envisioned humans as docile laborers under direct godly supervision. Enlil's initial attempts to control human population growth involved sending plagues and famines that would reduce numbers to manageable levels without completely eliminating the species. The Atrahasis epic describes 3 successive attempts at population control, each involving different divine agents and methodologies. The first plague, administered through Namtar, the plague god, targeted specific age groups and social classes to achieve demographic rebalancing without disrupting essential agricultural production. When this selective approach proved insufficient, Enlil authorized more comprehensive famine conditions that would force human communities to compete for scarce resources. The god's strategy involved manipulating weather patterns and agricultural conditions to create widespread food shortages that would naturally reduce population levels through starvation and conflict. Adad, the storm god, withheld the seasonal rains that enabled crop growth, while other deities responsible for fertility and abundance withdrew their support from human agricultural activities. The resulting famines achieved temporary population reductions but failed to address the fundamental problem of human cultural independence that concerned Enlil most deeply. Enki's repeated intervention to assist humanity during these crises created mounting tension within the divine assembly and established the theological framework for the flood narrative. The god's provision of alternative food sources, irrigation techniques, and survival strategies enabled human communities to weather divine punishment more successfully than Enlil had anticipated. These interventions violated the assembly's decisions and represented a form of divine insubordination that challenged the hierarchical authority structure governing Anunnaki relationships. The escalating conflict between Enlil and Enki reflected deeper theological questions about the nature of divine justice and the extent to which individual gods could pursue independent policies that contradicted collective decisions. Enlil's position emphasized the importance of maintaining cosmic order through strict enforcement of divine authority, while Enki's actions suggested that wisdom and compassion should temper the application of divine power. This fundamental disagreement about divine governance would reach its climax in the flood decision and its aftermath. The assembly's final decision to destroy humanity through flood represented a compromise that addressed Enlil's concerns about human independence while providing a definitive solution to the population problem. The Atrahasis epic describes elaborate deliberations in which various gods presented arguments for different approaches to the human crisis. Some deities supported Enlil's position that complete destruction was necessary to restore proper cosmic order, while others advocated for more moderate measures that would preserve human civilization while addressing legitimate divine concerns. The flood mechanism itself reflected sophisticated understanding of hydraulic engineering and meteorological processes that characterized Mesopotamian civilization's relationship with its riverine environment. The gods' decision to overwhelm existing flood control systems through coordinated attacks on multiple fronts demonstrated their comprehensive knowledge of the infrastructure that sustained human settlements. Adad would provide unprecedented rainfall from above, while Enki would release subterranean waters from the Abzu, creating a dual assault that would overwhelm even the most sophisticated human engineering projects. The Assembly's oath of secrecy regarding the flood plan created the dramatic tension that drives the narrative forward and establishes Enki's moral dilemma. The gods swore binding oaths that prevented them from directly warning humans about the impending destruction. But these restrictions applied only to direct communication rather than indirect methods that preserved the letter while violating the spirit of the agreement. Enki's solution involved speaking to the reed wall of Atrahasis's house rather than to the man himself. A technical compliance with the oath enabled him to provide essential survival information. The instructions Enki provided to Atrahasis through this indirect communication method revealed detailed knowledge of shipbuilding techniques and survival strategies that reflect actual Mesopotamian maritime technology. The gods specified exact dimensions for the vessel that would preserve human and animal life through the flood, 120 cubits in length, width, and height, creating a perfect cube that symbolized cosmic completeness. The ship's construction required specific materials including palm fiber, bitumen, and various types of wood that were readily available in southern Mesopotamia and possessed the waterproofing qualities necessary for extended ocean voyaging. The 7-day construction period that Enki allowed for the ark's completion paralleled the cosmic week that structured divine and human temporal experience throughout Mesopotamian culture. This timeline required Atrahasis to mobilize extensive community resources and labor while maintaining secrecy about the project's true purpose. The text describes how the builder provided food and drink for his workers while deflecting questions about the vessel's intended use, claiming it was designed for a trading expedition to distant lands. The loading of animals onto the ark followed systematic procedures that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of species preservation and ecological relationships. Atrahasis gathered breeding pairs of wild animals while also including domestic species that would be essential for re-establishing agricultural civilization after the floodwaters receded. The text specifies that clean animals were taken in groups of 7 pairs while unclean species were limited to single pairs, establishing distinctions that would later appear in Hebrew flood narratives but reflected earlier Mesopotamian concepts about ritual purity and sacrifice. The flood itself began with supernatural phenomena that announced the significance of the impending destruction. The Atrahasis epic describes how normal weather patterns ceased as divine forces took direct control of atmospheric and hydrological systems. Darkness covered the earth even during daylight hours, while earthquake tremors announced the release of subterranean waters that would supplement the torrential rains. These preliminary signs provided final warnings for any humans who possessed sufficient wisdom to interpret divine communications through natural phenomena. The actual deluge combined multiple water sources in a coordinated assault that overwhelmed all existing flood control infrastructure. Adad storms provided continuous rainfall that exceeded the capacity of drainage systems, while the Anunnaki collectively opened the fountains of the great deep that released underground water reserves. The Epic of Gilgamesh's parallel account describes how even the gods were frightened by the flood's intensity, with Ishtar crying out in distress at the destruction of her human worshippers and the Anunnaki cowering like dogs in the highest heavens. The 7-day duration of the flood proper corresponded to the cosmic week, while providing sufficient time for complete inundation of inhabited areas. The waters rose above the highest mountains, eliminating all terrestrial life except for the carefully preserved specimens aboard Atrahasis' vessel. The text describes how human settlements, temples, and agricultural infrastructure disappeared beneath the expanding waters, erasing millennia of cultural development and technological achievement in a matter of days. The psychological impact of the flood on the divine assembly became apparent as the destruction proceeded beyond what many gods had anticipated or desired. The Gilgamesh version describes Ishtar's regret at supporting the flood decision, while other deities expressed dismay at the complete elimination of the worship and offerings that had sustained divine-human relationships. These emotional responses revealed the extent to which the gods had become dependent on human service, and highlighted the economic dimensions of the crisis that the flood created for divine society. Enki's secret preservation of human civilization through his warning to Atrahasis represented more than simple compassion. It constituted a calculated strategy to maintain the benefits of human service while addressing legitimate concerns about population control and cultural independence. The gods' actions ensured that post-flood humanity would possess the knowledge and skills necessary to rebuild civilization, while remaining appropriately grateful for divine intervention in their survival. This approach balanced competing interests within the divine assembly while preserving the fundamental relationship between gods and mortals. The flood's conclusion involved carefully orchestrated procedures that tested the extent of destruction while preparing for the restoration of normal cosmic order. Atrahasis released birds at regular intervals to determine when dry land had emerged sufficiently to support renewed habitation. The dove's return with an olive leaf provided confirmation that vegetation had begun to recover, while the raven's failure to return indicated that carrion from the flood's victims had been sufficiently dispersed to prevent disease outbreaks. The ark's landing on Mount Nazur, identified with modern Pir Omar Gudrun in the Zagros Mountains, positioned the flood survivors in highland territory that had remained above the floodwaters and possessed the resources necessary for immediate survival. This location provided access to fresh water, wild game, and materials for constructing temporary shelters, while the lowland areas dried sufficiently for permanent resettlement. The mountain's sacred associations in later Mesopotamian tradition reflected its role as the birthplace of renewed human civilization. Atrahasis's first act upon leaving the ark involved constructing an altar and offering sacrifices that announced humanity's survival to the divine assembly. The smoke from these offerings, described as having a sweet savor, attracted the gods who had been deprived of human worship throughout the flood period. The Gilgamesh account describes how the gods gathered like flies around the sacrifice, emphasizing their eagerness to reestablish the economic relationships that human worship provided. The assembly's response to discovering human survival created the final crisis that required resolution through a new covenant between gods and mortals. Enlil's initial rage at learning that his flood plan had been subverted by Enki's intervention threatened to restart the divine conflict that had precipitated the original crisis. The gods' demand for punishment of those responsible for preserving humanity forced the assembly to address fundamental questions about divine authority and the limits of collective decision-making power. Er's defense of his actions before the divine assembly established precedents for divine descent that would influence Mesopotamian theology throughout subsequent periods. The god argued that complete human destruction would have eliminated the worship and service that sustained divine civilization, creating problems for the gods that outweighed any benefits from population control. His speech emphasized practical considerations about divine-human economic relationships while acknowledging the legitimacy of concerns about human independence and cultural development. The Assembly's final resolution involved establishing new parameters for divine-human relationships that addressed the concerns that had led to the flood while preventing future conflicts of similar magnitude. The gods agreed to impose natural limits on human population growth through increased infant mortality, diseases that would affect specific age groups, and social institutions like celibate priesthood that would reduce reproductive rates. These measures would maintain manageable population levels without requiring periodic catastrophic interventions that disrupted the stability of both divine and human societies. The Covenant's provisions regarding divine accessibility represented another significant innovation that addressed human cultural independence while maintaining appropriate hierarchical relationships. The gods agreed to communicate their will through established channels including divination, dreams, and prophetic inspiration rather than through direct intervention that had characterized earlier periods. This arrangement preserved divine authority while allowing human societies to develop their own institutions and cultural practices within parameters acceptable to their divine overseers. The covenant established between the Anunnaki and humanity following the Great Flood created the theological foundation for a revolutionary system of urban governance that would define Mesopotamian civilization for over 3 millennia. Rather than maintaining direct oversight of human affairs through periodic divine interventions, the gods established permanent earthly residences within specific city-states, creating a patron deity system that distributed divine authority across the geographical landscape while maintaining hierarchical relationships within the celestial bureaucracy. This decentralized approach to divine governance allowed individual Anunnaki to develop intimate relationships with particular human communities while preserving the collective authority of the divine assembly for matters affecting the broader cosmic order. Enlil's selection of Nippur as his primary earthly residence established the paradigm for divine city patronage that other Anunnaki would follow throughout Sumer and Akkad. The god's choice reflected both practical and theological considerations that would influence urban development patterns across Mesopotamia. Nippur's central location within the alluvial plain provided equal access to all major Sumerian cities, making it an ideal site for a deity whose authority encompassed the entire region. The city's elevation above the surrounding marshlands offered protection from seasonal flooding, while maintaining access to the waterways that connected it to other urban centers through an extensive network of canals and rivers. The Akkor temple complex that housed Enlil's earthly residence represented the most sophisticated architectural achievement of early dynastic Mesopotamia, establishing design principles that would influence religious construction throughout the ancient Near East. The temple's massive ziggurat, rising in 7 distinct stages toward the heavens, created a physical representation of the cosmic hierarchy that placed Enlil at the intersection between divine and human realms. Each level of the served specific ritual functions, with priests ascending through increasingly sacred spaces as they approached the god's private chambers at the summit. Archaeological excavations at Nippur have revealed the extensive infrastructure required to support Enlil's earthly establishment, including residential quarters for hundreds of priests, workshops for producing ritual objects, granaries for storing agricultural offerings, and administrative offices where scribes maintained detailed records of temple operations. The complex employed thousands of workers whose specialized skills sustained elaborate ritual cycles that reinforced Enlil's authority over both natural phenomena and human political structures. Craftsmen produced the ceremonial weapons, jewelry, and textiles that adorned the god's cult statue, while musicians and singers performed the hymns and liturgies that accompanied daily worship services. The economic scale of Enlil's temple operations dwarfed those of any secular institution in Mesopotamian society, with administrative archives documenting the management of vast agricultural estates, livestock herds, and manufacturing enterprises that generated the wealth necessary to sustain divine service. The Draham archive, dating to the Earthard period, records the delivery of over 100,000 cattle and sheep annually to Enlil's temple for sacrificial purposes, indicating the massive scale of resources devoted to maintaining divine favor. These offerings came from throughout Mesopotamia as rulers from distant cities sent tribute to acknowledge Enlil's authority and seek his blessing for their political and military endeavors. Enki's establishment at Eridu created a contrasting model of divine city patronage that emphasized wisdom, craftsmanship, and the technical knowledge essential for urban civilization. The god's temple complex included extensive educational facilities where scribes learned the cuneiform writing system, mathematicians developed computational techniques for architectural and astronomical calculations, and engineers studied the hydraulic principles that enabled irrigation agriculture. These scholarly activities positioned Eridu as Mesopotamia's premier center for intellectual development, attracting students from across the region who sought training in the specialized skills that sustained urban society. The Abzu temple's unique architectural features reflected Enki's association with freshwater sources and his role as patron of the crafts that transformed raw materials into useful products. The temple's foundation extended below ground level to create symbolic connection with the underground waters that fed Mesopotamia's rivers and canals, while its workshops produced the finest examples of metalwork, textile production, and ceramic manufacture found anywhere in the ancient world. Master craftsmen working under divine patronage developed innovative techniques that advanced technological capabilities while creating objects of extraordinary beauty and utility. Enki's priests maintained detailed records of technical procedures and scientific observations that constituted Mesopotamia's earliest systematic approach to empirical knowledge. Medical texts preserved in the temple library documented surgical procedures, pharmaceutical preparations, and diagnostic techniques that represented sophisticated understanding of human anatomy and disease processes. Mathematical tablets recorded computational methods for calculating areas, volumes, and astronomical cycles that enabled accurate calendar keeping and architectural planning. These scholarly achievements demonstrated how divine patronage could foster intellectual development that benefited both religious and secular aspects of human civilization. Inanna's patronage of Uruk established yet another model of divine city governance that emphasized the dynamic relationship between sacred and secular authority through the institution of sacred marriage. The goddess's dual nature as deity of both love and war created theological tensions that required careful management through elaborate ritual cycles that channeled her potentially destructive energies toward constructive purposes. Her temple complex, known as the Inanna, featured separate precincts dedicated to her contrasting aspects, with priests specializing in either martial or fertility functions depending on seasonal requirements and political circumstances. The sacred marriage ceremony that annually renewed Inanna's relationship with the reigning king of Uruk represented the most sophisticated expression of divine human political integration achieved in Mesopotamian civilization. This ritual, known as hieroskimos, involved the king assuming the role of Dumuzi, Inanna's mythological consort, in a ceremonial union that symbolically transferred divine authority to earthly rulership while ensuring the goddess's continued support for the city's prosperity and military success. The ceremony required months of preparation involving purification rituals, costume preparation, and rehearsals that transformed the king from a mortal ruler into a temporary embodiment of divine power. The architectural setting for the sacred marriage reflected the ceremony's cosmic significance through careful attention to astronomical alignments and symbolic decoration that connected earthly events to celestial patterns. The temple's marriage chamber, located at the ziggurat summit, featured elaborate furnishings including a golden bed, precious textiles, and ritual objects that had been consecrated through preliminary ceremonies involving the entire population of Uruk. The chamber's windows aligned with specific stellar configurations that marked the optimal timing for the ritual's performance, demonstrating sophisticated understanding of astronomical cycles and their relationship to agricultural and political activities. The economic implications of the sacred marriage extended far beyond its religious significance to encompass comprehensive systems of resource distribution and social organization that integrated divine worship with practical governance. The ceremony's successful completion ensured Inanna's blessing for the coming agricultural year, with the goddess's favor manifesting through abundant harvests, successful military campaigns, and prosperity in trade relationships with neighboring cities. Conversely, any disruption of the ritual cycle could result in divine displeasure expressed through crop failures, military defeats, or economic instability that threatened the city's survival. Inanna's patronage of Ur created the most economically sophisticated temple administration in Mesopotamian history, with the moon god's priests developing innovative financial instruments and commercial practices that facilitated long-distance trade throughout the ancient world. The god's association with temporal measurement positioned his temple as authoritative source for calendar calculations that coordinated agricultural, commercial, and religious activities across multiple city-states. Merchants throughout Mesopotamia synchronized their trading expeditions with lunar cycles calculated by Inanna's priests, while farmers planned planting and harvesting schedules according to calendars distributed from the temple complex. The ziggurat of Nanna at Ur, known as the Ekishnugal, featured sophisticated astronomical observation facilities that enabled precise tracking of lunar phases and planetary movements essential for maintaining calendar accuracy. The temple's archives preserve thousands of mathematical tablets documenting complex calculations required to reconcile lunar months with solar years, a computational challenge that required advanced understanding of fractional arithmetic and algebraic relationships. These mathematical achievements represented some of the most sophisticated intellectual work produced in the ancient world, demonstrating how religious requirements could drive technological innovation that benefited broader society. The priesthood hierarchies that developed within each city's patron temple reflected the specialized knowledge and administrative skills required to maintain divine service while managing vast economic enterprises. At Nippur, Enlil's high priest, known as the An, served as the god's primary earthly representative with authority over religious, political, and economic affairs that affected the entire Sumerian confederation. This position required mastery of theological doctrine, legal precedents, and administrative procedures that enabled effective coordination between divine will and human needs across multiple domains of activity. Subordinate priestly ranks included the Sangu, who supervised daily temple operations and managed the extensive workforce required for ritual performance and economic production. These middle-level administrators possessed specialized knowledge of liturgical requirements, accounting procedures, and craft techniques that enabled them to coordinate complex activities involving hundreds of workers and massive resource flows. The Mushiapu priests specialized in ritual purification and exorcism, maintaining the spiritual cleanliness essential for effective divine communication, while the Kalu priests performed the musical liturgies that accompanied sacrificial offerings and seasonal celebrations. The training required for priestly service involved decades of study in temple schools, where students mastered cuneiform literacy, mathematical computation, astronomical observation, and theological doctrine necessary for effective temple administration. The curriculum included extensive memorization of hymns, prayers, and ritual procedures that preserved traditional practices while allowing for adaptation to changing circumstances. Advanced students specialized in particular aspects of temple operations, developing expertise in areas such as divination, medical practice, or commercial law that enabled them to serve both religious and secular functions within their communities. Women played crucial roles within temple hierarchies, particularly in institutions dedicated to goddesses like Inanna, where female priests known as Enta served as the deity's primary earthly representatives. These high-ranking priestesses possessed authority comparable to their male counterparts, supervising extensive temple operations while maintaining the ritual purity essential for divine communication. The Entu of Inanna at Uruk held responsibility for the sacred marriage ceremony, serving as the goddess' earthly embodiment during the king's symbolic union with divine power. The Nadata priestesses, documented extensively in Old Babylonian archives, represented another category of female religious specialists who combined spiritual service with commercial activities that generated substantial income for temple institutions. These women, who remained celibate throughout their careers, managed agricultural estates, engaged in money-lending operations, and coordinated trade relationships that connected temple economies with broader commercial networks. Their business activities required sophisticated understanding of contract law, market conditions, and financial instruments that positioned them among the most economically knowledgeable individuals in Mesopotamian society. Temple architecture evolved to accommodate the complex ritual requirements and administrative functions that characterized mature Anunnaki worship, with successive building phases creating increasingly elaborate complexes that dominated their urban environments. The standard temple layout included a central sanctuary housing the deity's cult statue, surrounded by chambers for storing ritual implements, preparing offerings, and housing priests. Courtyards provided space for large-scale ceremonies involving entire urban populations, while administrative wings contained archives, workshops, and residential quarters necessary for temple operations. The technological sophistication of temple construction reflected both religious requirements and practical considerations about structural stability and environmental adaptation. Builders developed innovative techniques for creating waterproof foundations in marshy terrain, constructing earthquake-resistant walls capable of supporting massive superstructures, and designing drainage systems that prevented flood damage to sacred precincts. The use of fired brick rather than sun-dried mud brick for temple construction demonstrated the enormous resources devoted to creating permanent divine residences that would endure across multiple generations. Ritual practices within Anunnaki temples followed carefully prescribed procedures that maintained divine favor, while providing meaningful religious experiences for human participants. Daily services included morning and evening offerings of food, drink, and incense that sustained the deity's earthly residence, accompanied by musical performances and liturgical recitations that honored divine attributes and requested continued blessing. The god's cult statue received personal care including washing, clothing changes, and presentation of meals that treated the divine image as a living presence requiring constant attention. Seasonal festivals created opportunities for entire urban populations to participate in divine worship through processions, communal meals, and ritual performances that reinforced social cohesion while honoring patron deities. The key to New Year's celebration involved elaborate ceremonies that symbolically renewed divine kingship and cosmic order, with the patron deity's statue traveling throughout the city to receive homage from all social classes. These public rituals demonstrated divine approval for existing political arrangements, while providing opportunities for rulers to display their piety and generosity through magnificent offerings and entertainment for their subjects. The integration of divine worship with practical governance created temple institutions that functioned as comprehensive administrative centers, managing legal disputes, commercial transactions, and social services that affected entire urban populations. Temple courts adjudicated conflicts involving contract violations, property disputes, and family law matters, with priests serving as judges whose decisions carried divine authority. These legal functions positioned temples as essential institutions for maintaining social order while ensuring that human behavior conformed divine moral standards. The political ascendancy of Babylon during the early 2nd millennium BCE fundamentally transformed Anunnaki theology through the systematic elevation of Marduk from a relatively minor deity to supreme king of the gods. This theological revolution, codified most comprehensively in the Enuma Elish creation epic, represented far more than simple religious propaganda supporting Babylonian political ambitions. The restructuring of divine hierarchy required sophisticated theological arguments that preserved the authority of established Anunnaki while accommodating Marduk's unprecedented rise to cosmic supremacy. Marduk's genealogical credentials as Enki's son provided the essential foundation for his claim to supreme authority within existing Anunnaki structures. Babylonian theologians emphasized his inheritance of his father's wisdom and technical expertise while adding martial prowess that distinguished him from the contemplative Enki. The god's youth represented an advantage rather than a liability in confronting primordial chaos forces that threatened established cosmic order, as older deities like Anu and Enlil had proven inadequate to the challenge posed by Tiamat's rebellion. The Enuma Elish's account of Marduk's rise to power through combat with Tiamat established precedents for divine authority based on demonstrated capability rather than traditional inheritance or seniority. The epic describes how the established gods, faced with Tiamat's threat to destroy the younger generation of deities, offered supreme kingship to any god capable of defeating the primordial chaos monster. Marduk's acceptance of this challenge, contingent on receiving permanent authority over all divine decisions, created a contractual basis for his supremacy that satisfied legal requirements while acknowledging his exceptional qualifications. The weapons and powers that Marduk assembled for his confrontation with Tiamat reflected Babylonian understanding of the technological and organizational capabilities required for effective governance. The god's bow, described as creating lightning when drawn, represented mastery over atmospheric phenomena previously associated with Enlil's authority. His net, woven from the four winds, demonstrated control over directional forces that enabled comprehensive military strategy. The hurricane that filled his body provided the raw power necessary to overwhelm opposition, while his chariot, drawn by 4 horses, enabled rapid movement across cosmic battlefields. Marduk's tactical approach to defeating Tiamat revealed sophisticated military thinking that would influence Babylonian strategic doctrine throughout subsequent periods. Rather than engaging in direct frontal assault, the god employed deception and superior technology to neutralize his opponent's advantages. His inflation of Tiamat through forced ingestion of wind rendered her vulnerable to internal attack, while his net prevented her escape once the battle commenced. The precision shot that split her body in half demonstrated marksmanship skills that required extensive training and natural talent. The cosmic reorganization that followed Marduk's victory established new principles of divine administration that centralized authority while maintaining functional specialization among subordinate deities. The god's division of Tiamat's corpse to create heaven and earth positioned him as supreme architect of the physical universe, while his appointment of other Anunnaki to specific administrative roles preserved their dignity within the new hierarchy. This reorganization balanced revolutionary change with conservative preservation of existing institutions, enabling smooth transition to Babylonian theological supremacy. The 50 names of Marduk, recited at the Enuma Elish's conclusion, provided comprehensive theological justification for the god's absorption of powers and attributes previously distributed among multiple Anunnaki. Each name represented specific aspects of divine authority that Marduk had acquired through his victory over chaos, creating a systematic theology that explained how one deity could effectively govern functions previously requiring an entire pantheon. This consolidation reflected Babylonian administrative preferences for centralized authority while acknowledging the complexity of cosmic governance. Babylonian temple architecture evolved to accommodate Marduk's supreme status through construction of increasingly magnificent sanctuaries that surpassed earlier Sumerian religious complexes in scale and sophistication. The Asagila temple complex in Babylon featured a ziggurat known as Epic, reaching approximately 90 meters in height and visible from distances of several kilometers across the Mesopotamian plain. This structure's massive scale required engineering innovations that pushed contemporary construction techniques to their limits while creating a physical manifestation of Marduk's cosmic authority. The Ishtar Gate, serving as the ceremonial entrance to Babylon's sacred precinct, demonstrated the artistic and technological achievements that Marduk's patronage enabled. The gate's brilliant blue-glazed brick facade, decorated with relief sculptures of dragons and bulls representing Marduk and associated deities, created visual impact that reinforced theological messages about divine power and royal authority. The processional way leading to the gate featured similar decorative programs that transformed routine religious processions into spectacular displays of divine and earthly magnificence. The Akitu festival, celebrated annually in Babylon, represented the most elaborate religious ceremony developed in Mesopotamian civilization, requiring 11 days of complex rituals that renewed both divine kingship and earthly royal authority. The festival's centerpiece involved Marduk's symbolic reenactment of his victory over Tiamat through ritual combat performed by priests wearing appropriate costumes and masks. This ceremony reinforced theological teachings about cosmic order while providing spectacular entertainment that attracted visitors from throughout the known world. The humiliation ritual performed by the Babylonian king during Akitu demonstrated the sophisticated balance between divine and royal authority that characterized mature Mesopotamian political theology. The high priest's removal of royal insignia and physical striking of the monarch symbolized the temporary suspension of earthly power while divine authority underwent renewal. The king's declaration of innocence regarding temple maintenance, urban welfare, and military protection provided public accountability for royal performance while acknowledging ultimate dependence on divine favor. Assyrian adaptation of Anunnaki mythology reflected the military empire's distinctive political requirements and cultural preferences while maintaining essential theological continuities with earlier Mesopotamian traditions. The elevation of Ashur from local city deity to supreme national god paralleled Marduk's rise in Babylonian theology, but emphasized martial aspects of divine authority that supported Assyrian imperial ideology. Ashur's identification with the Assyrian state itself created unprecedented fusion of the religious and political identity that distinguished Assyrian civilization from its Mesopotamian predecessors. The theological integration of Ashur within existing Anunnaki hierarchy required careful negotiation of competing claims to supreme authority that might have created conflicts with established Babylonian religious doctrine. Assyrian theologians resolved this potential problem by emphasizing Ashur's role as military commander of the divine assembly rather than replacing Marduk's cosmic kingship entirely. This arrangement preserved diplomatic relationships with Babylonian religious institutions while asserting Assyrian political supremacy through divine military leadership. Assyrian royal inscriptions consistently portrayed military campaigns as religious wars fought on behalf of Ashur and the Anunnaki against foreign deities who threatened cosmic order. Sargon's annals describe his conquest of Urartu as punishment for that kingdom's neglect of proper divine worship, while Sennacherib's siege of Jerusalem represented Ashur's judgment against Hezekiah's religious reforms that had eliminated Assyrian cult installations. These theological interpretations transformed political conflicts into cosmic struggles between order and chaos that justified extreme military measures against resistant populations. The Assyrian royal library at Nineveh, assembled primarily during Ashurbanipal's reign in the 7th century BCE, preserved the most comprehensive collection of Anunnaki literature ever assembled in the ancient world. The library's systematic acquisition program gathered texts from temples and scribal schools throughout Mesopotamia, creating a scholarly resource that enabled comparative analysis of different regional traditions regarding divine mythology and ritual practice. This intellectual project reflected Assyrian commitment to preserving Mesopotamian cultural heritage while adapting it to imperial requirements. The standardization of Anunnaki mythology achieved through Ashurbanipal's library project created authoritative versions of major compositions that influenced subsequent transmission of Mesopotamian religious literature. Scribes working under royal patronage produced carefully edited copies of epics, hymns, and ritual texts that reconciled variant readings while preserving essential theological content. These standardized texts became the basis for later Neo-Babylonian and Persian period copies that transmitted Mesopotamian religious traditions to subsequent civilizations. Neo-Babylonian revival movements during the 6th century BCE represented conscious attempts to restore authentic Mesopotamian religious traditions that had been modified or neglected during periods of foreign domination. Nebuchadnezzar II's massive construction projects in Babylon included complete rebuilding of major temples according to ancient architectural principles preserved in cuneiform archives. These restoration efforts required extensive archaeological investigation of earlier building phases and consultation with traditional texts that documented proper ritual procedures and specifications. The scholarly activities sponsored by Neo-Babylonian rulers created unprecedented opportunities for systematic study of Anunnaki traditions through comparison of texts from different periods and regions. Priests working in temple libraries developed sophisticated philological techniques for analyzing variant readings and reconstructing damaged passages in ancient compositions. Their commentaries on classical texts preserved interpretive traditions that explained obscure references and provided theological context for understanding complex mythological narratives. Nabu's elevation to unprecedented prominence during the Neo-Babylonian period reflected the intellectual character of this cultural revival and the importance of scholarly activity in preserving traditional religious knowledge. As patron deity of writing and wisdom, Nabu's cult attracted scribes and scholars whose work maintained continuity with earlier Mesopotamian intellectual traditions while adapting them to contemporary needs. The god's temple at Borsippa became a major center for copying and studying ancient texts, with its library rivaling Ashurbanipal's collection in scope and scholarly sophistication. The integration of foreign deities into traditional Anunnaki frameworks during periods of cultural exchange demonstrated the flexibility and adaptability that enabled Mesopotamian religious traditions to survive political upheavals and demographic changes. Persian period texts from Babylon show how Ahura Mazda and other Zoroastrian deities were incorporated into existing divine hierarchies through identification with established Anunnaki or assignment to specialized roles that complemented traditional functions. This theological accommodation enabled Persian administrators to maintain legitimacy while respecting local religious sensibilities. Greek influence during the Seleucid period created additional challenges and opportunities for Anunnaki theological development as Mesopotamian scholars encountered Hellenic philosophical concepts and mythological traditions. The identification of Marduk with Zeus and Nabu with Apollo reflected systematic attempts to create theological bridges between different cultural traditions while preserving essential Mesopotamian religious content. These syncretistic developments influenced both Greek understanding of Near Eastern religion and Mesopotamian adaptation to Hellenistic cultural contexts. The astronomical interest that characterized late Mesopotamian scholarship created new interpretive frameworks for understanding Anunnaki mythology through celestial observations and mathematical analysis. Babylonian astronomers identified individual deities with specific stars and planetary movements, creating systematic correspondences between mythological narratives and observable celestial phenomena. These scientific approaches to religious interpretation influenced both indigenous theological development and the transmission of Mesopotamian astronomical knowledge to Greek and later Islamic scholars. The persistence of Anunnaki worship into the Parthian and Sasanian periods demonstrated the deep cultural roots that these religious traditions had developed throughout 3 millennia of continuous practice. Archaeological evidence from sites like Babylon and Uruk shows continued temple maintenance and ritual activity well into the Common Era, with cuneiform texts documenting traditional ceremonies performed for increasingly small communities of practitioners. These late manifestations of ancient traditions preserved essential theological concepts that would influence subsequent religious developments in the region. The gradual transformation of Anunnaki concepts into folk traditions and magical practices reflected the adaptation of sophisticated theological systems to changing social and political circumstances that no longer supported elaborate temple institutions. Incantation texts from the early Islamic period show how individual Anunnaki continued to be invoked for protection and assistance in personal matters, though their cosmic authority had been superseded by monotheistic religious systems. These survivals demonstrate the enduring appeal of Mesopotamian religious concepts and their influence on subsequent cultural developments throughout the Near East and beyond. Alexander the Great's conquest of Babylon in 331 BCE marked the beginning of a profound transformation in Anunnaki worship that would fundamentally alter the character of Mesopotamian religious practice over the subsequent centuries. The Macedonian king's initial respect for local religious traditions, demonstrated through his participation in traditional Babylonian coronation ceremonies and his orders to restore damaged temples, created a deceptive continuity that masked the deeper cultural changes his conquest would unleash. The young conqueror's death in Babylon 8 years later, possibly in the very palace where Nebuchadnezzar had once ruled, symbolically marked the end of purely Mesopotamian control over the religious traditions that had shaped the region for 3 millennia. The Seleucid dynasty's establishment of Greek administrative systems throughout their vast empire created unprecedented challenges for traditional Anunnaki worship, as Hellenistic bureaucratic structures operated according to fundamentally different principles than the temple-centered governance that had characterized earlier Mesopotamian civilization. Greek administrators, trained in philosophical traditions that emphasized rational inquiry and systematic classification, approached religious phenomena as subjects for intellectual analysis rather than objects of devotional practice. This analytical perspective, while not necessarily hostile to local traditions, created conceptual frameworks that gradually transformed how educated populations understood divine authority and cosmic order. The foundation of Seleucia on the Tigris as a new administrative capital deliberately positioned Greek colonial authority alongside, rather than within existing Mesopotamian urban centers, creating parallel power structures that competed for resources and population. The new city's Greek theater, gymnasium, and agora provided alternative social institutions that attracted ambitious Mesopotamians seeking advancement within Hellenistic administrative hierarchies. These secular civic spaces offered cultural experiences that rivaled traditional temple festivals in their ability to create community, identity, and social cohesion, gradually reducing the exclusive authority that religious institutions had previously exercised over urban life. The intellectual ferment created by contact between Greek philosophical traditions and Mesopotamian theological scholarship produced remarkable synthetic developments that preserved essential Anunnaki concepts while adapting them to Hellenistic cultural contexts. Brasus, a Babylonian priest writing in Greek during the early 3rd century BCE, created the most comprehensive attempt to present Mesopotamian religious traditions to Greek audiences through his Babyloniaca, a 3-volume work that translated cuneiform mythological narratives into Greek literary forms while maintaining their essential theological content. His account of the Anunnaki as divine beings who descended from heaven to teach humanity. The arts of civilization resonated with Greek traditions about culture heroes and divine benefactors, creating conceptual bridges between different mythological systems. The identification of individual Anunnaki with Greek deities represented a systematic theological project that required careful analysis of divine attributes and functions to establish meaningful correspondences between different religious traditions. Marduk's identification with Zeus reflected obvious parallels in their roles as supreme kings of their respective pantheons. While both deities' associations with storm phenomena and authority provided additional points of connection. However, this identification also transformed understanding of Marduk's character by emphasizing his role as cosmic ruler while de-emphasizing the complex theological relationships with other Anunnaki that had characterized traditional Babylonian religious thought. Nabu's equation with Apollo created particularly productive synthetic possibilities, as both deities governed intellectual activities including writing, prophecy, and artistic inspiration. The Greek gods' association with the Delphic oracle provided a familiar framework for understanding Nabu's role in divination, while his patronage of poetry and music resonated with the Mesopotamian deities' connection to scholarly and scribal activities. Hellenistic period texts from Babylon show how this identification enabled Greek-educated Mesopotamians to participate in both cultural traditions simultaneously, invoking Apollo-Nabu in contexts that required both Greek literary sophistication and traditional Mesopotamian religious authority. The syncretistic developments that emerged in multicultural Hellenistic cities created unprecedented religious innovations that combined Anunnaki theology with Greek philosophical concepts and Egyptian magical practices. The city of Dur-Europos on the Euphrates, founded by Seleucus I around 300 BCE, provides archaeological evidence for this religious creativity through temple complexes that housed multiple traditions within shared architectural spaces. The site's Mesopotamian temple featured traditional Babylonian religious art alongside Greek-style sculptures and inscriptions, while ritual deposits included objects reflecting Egyptian, Persian, and Arabian religious influences. The transformation of Anunnaki worship in Hellenistic urban contexts involved significant changes in ritual practice that reflected new social realities and cultural preferences. Traditional temple festivals that had previously involved entire urban populations became more specialized events that attracted primarily those families maintaining ancestral connections to Mesopotamian religious traditions. The elaborate processions and public ceremonies that had once demonstrated divine authority to mixed populations were replaced by more intimate gatherings that emphasized community identity and cultural preservation rather than cosmic governance. The role of Babylonian astronomers in preserving Anunnaki in mythological traditions became crucial during this period of cultural transition, as their scientific expertise provided them with unique authority that transcended political and religious boundaries. The astronomical diaries maintained by temple scholars documented celestial observations with unprecedented precision while preserving traditional associations between planetary movements and divine activities. These scientific records enabled Babylonian astronomers to maintain their professional status within Hellenistic intellectual circles while continuing to serve traditional religious functions within their local communities. The mathematical sophistication achieved by Babylonian astronomers during the Seleucid period represented the culmination of millennia of scholarly development that had been fostered by temple institutions dedicated to Anunnaki worship. Their development of sophisticated predictive models for planetary motion required computational techniques that surpassed contemporary Greek mathematical capabilities, earning them recognition throughout the Hellenistic world as the foremost authorities on celestial phenomena. This scientific reputation enabled them to preserve and transmit traditional mythological interpretations of astronomical events to audiences that might otherwise have dismissed Mesopotamian religious concepts as primitive superstition. The Babylonian astronomer CATMIU, working during the 4th century BCE, exemplified this synthesis of scientific rigor with traditional religious knowledge through his development of mathematical models that could predict lunar eclipses with remarkable accuracy, while maintaining traditional interpretations of these events as manifestations of divine displeasure or cosmic conflict. His computational methods, preserved in cuneiform mathematical texts, influenced both Hellenistic astronomical theory and traditional Mesopotamian divination practices, demonstrating how scientific innovation could serve both secular and religious purposes simultaneously. The gradual transformation of Anunnaki from active deities governing cosmic affairs to astrological and magical figures reflected broader cultural changes that reduced the political authority of traditional religious institutions while preserving their specialized knowledge for private consultation. Hellenistic period magical papyri from Egypt contain numerous invocations of Mesopotamian deities, but these texts treat the Anunnaki as powerful spirits available for individual magical manipulation, rather than as cosmic rulers whose authority shaped political and natural events. This transformation preserved the names and basic attributes of traditional deities, while fundamentally altering their theological significance and social function. The development of personal horoscopic astrology during the Hellenistic period created new contexts for Anunnaki influence that emphasized individual destiny rather than cosmic governance. Babylonian astronomers adapted their traditional knowledge of planetary deity associations to create personalized predictions based on birth dates and celestial configurations, transforming cosmic theology into practical guidance for private decision-making. This individualization of divine influence reflected broader Hellenistic cultural trends that emphasized personal achievement and private religious experience over communal identity and public ritual observance. The magical traditions that emerged from this transformation treated individual Anunnaki as specialized supernatural agents whose powers could be accessed through appropriate ritual procedures and incantations. Marduk's authority over cosmic order made him valuable for magical practices designed to impose control over chaotic situations, while Enki's association with wisdom and technical knowledge attracted practitioners seeking solutions to complex practical problems. These magical applications preserved detailed knowledge of traditional divine attributes while adapting them to serve individual rather than communal needs. The persistence of cuneiform literacy among specialized scholarly communities enabled the continued copying and study of traditional Anunnaki texts long after Aramaic and Greek had become the dominant languages for most administrative and commercial purposes. The latest datable cuneiform tablets from Babylon produced during the 1st century CE include copies of classical mythological compositions alongside astronomical and mathematical texts, indicating that traditional religious literature continued to be valued by scholarly communities even as its broader social relevance declined. The influence of Mesopotamian astronomical and astrological knowledge on Hellenistic intellectual culture created indirect channels through which Anunnaki concepts reached Mediterranean audiences that had no direct contact with Mesopotamian religious traditions. Greek astronomical texts incorporated Babylonian computational methods and observational data, while often preserving traditional deity names for planetary bodies and stellar configurations. This scientific transmission ensured that Anunnaki nomenclature and basic mythological associations would influence Western astronomical and astrological traditions for centuries after the collapse of Mesopotamian temple institutions. The Jewish communities that remained in Mesopotamia following the Babylonian exile developed complex relationships with traditional Anunnaki worship that involved both rejection of theology and adaptation of Mesopotamian religious concepts to monotheistic frameworks. The Book of Daniel's references to Babylonian religious practices demonstrate detailed knowledge of temple rituals and divine hierarchies, while apocalyptic literature from this period shows clear influence from Mesopotamian mythological narratives about cosmic conflict and divine judgment. These adaptations preserved essential structural elements of Anunnaki theology, while transforming their theological significance to conform with Jewish monotheistic requirements. The Parthian conquest of Mesopotamia during the 2nd century BCE created new political contexts that were more favorable to traditional religious practices than Hellenistic rule had been, as Parthian administrative policies generally respected local cultural autonomy while requiring only political loyalty to imperial authority. Archaeological evidence from Babylonian temple sites shows renewed construction activity and ritual innovation during the early Parthian period, suggesting that reduced Greek cultural pressure enabled partial revival of traditional religious institutions. However, these revivals operated within fundamentally altered social contexts that limited their scope and influence compared to earlier periods of Mesopotamian independence. The emergence of Mandine religious communities in southern Mesopotamia during the late Hellenistic or early Parthian period preserved significant elements of traditional Anunnaki mythology within Gnostic theological frameworks that emphasized esoteric knowledge and spiritual salvation. Mandine texts contain detailed cosmological narratives that show clear relationships to earlier Mesopotamian Cretan myths, while their ritual practices preserve techniques and terminology that derive from traditional temple liturgies. These religious developments demonstrate how ancient theological concepts could be adapted to serve new spiritual needs, while maintaining essential continuity with earlier traditions. The influence of Zoroastrian religious concepts on late Mesopotamian religious development created additional synthetic possibilities that combined Anunnaki theology with Persian dualistic cosmology and eschatological expectations. Texts from the Sasanian period show how traditional Mesopotamian deities were incorporated into Zoroastrian cosmic hierarchies as yazatas, or divine beings serving Ahura Mazda's cosmic authority. This theological accommodation enabled continued veneration of traditional deities within frameworks that satisfied Persian religious requirements while preserving essential elements of Mesopotamian religious identity. The transformation of Anunnaki worship during the Hellenistic era represented more than simple decline or cultural assimilation. It involved creative adaptation of ancient religious traditions to new social and intellectual contexts that preserved essential theological insights while enabling continued cultural relevance. The scientific achievements of Babylonian astronomers, the synthetic religious developments in multicultural cities, and the preservation of traditional knowledge through specialized scholarly communities all contributed to ensuring that Mesopotamian religious concepts would continue to influence subsequent cultural developments long after the collapse of the political and social institutions that had originally sustained them. The gradual dissolution of traditional Mesopotamian temple institutions during the early centuries of the Common Era didn't mark the complete disappearance of Anunnaki traditions from the intellectual landscape of the ancient world. Instead, these theological and mythological concepts underwent a complex process of preservation and transformation through networks of scholars, translators, and religious communities that maintained fragments of ancient wisdom within new cultural and linguistic contexts. The transmission of Mesopotamian knowledge during late antiquity occurred through multiple channels that often operated independently of each other, creating a diverse array of sources that preserved different aspects of Anunnaki traditions according to their specific intellectual interests and cultural requirements. The Syriac Christian communities that emerged in northern Mesopotamia during the 3rd and 4th centuries CE played a crucial role in preserving astronomical and mathematical knowledge that had originally developed within Anunnaki temple complexes. These scholars, working primarily in Edessa, Nisibis, and other centers of Syriac learning, translated Greek astronomical texts that incorporated Babylonian computational methods while also maintaining direct access to cuneiform sources through bilingual scholars who could still read the ancient script. The Syriac translation of Ptolemy's Almagest, completed during the 6th century, preserved Babylonian star catalogs and planetary theories that contained traditional deity names and mythological associations, ensuring that Anunnaki nomenclature would continue to influence astronomical terminology throughout the medieval period. The scholarly activities of figures like Severus Sibbect, working in the monastery of Kenishir during the 7th century, demonstrated how Syriac intellectuals maintained sophisticated understanding of Mesopotamian mathematical and astronomical traditions long after the collapse of the institutional structures that had originally sustained them. Sibbect's treatise on the astrolabe included detailed discussions of Babylonian computational methods for calculating planetary positions, while his mathematical works preserved numerical techniques that derived ultimately from cuneiform mathematical texts. His famous reference to Indian numerals as superior to Greek systems reflected comparative analysis that drew on multiple mathematical traditions, including Mesopotamian methods that he accessed through both Greek and Syriac sources. The Mandean religious communities of southern Mesopotamia preserved perhaps the most direct continuity with ancient Anunnaki traditions through their maintenance of ritual practices and mythological narratives that showed clear relationships to earlier Mesopotamian religious literature. The Mandean Cretan account preserved in the Ginza Rabbah contains cosmological narratives that parallel Mesopotamian Cretan myths, including references to primordial waters, divine assemblies, and the creation of humanity for divine service. The text's description of the Euthera, divine beings who govern different aspects of the cosmos, reflects clear structural similarities to Anunnaki hierarchies while adapting these concepts to serve Mandean theological requirements emphasizing spiritual salvation and esoteric knowledge. Mandean ritual practices preserved technical terminology and procedural details that derived from ancient Mesopotamian temple liturgies, though adapted to serve different theological purposes. The Masikta ceremony, performed to ensure the spiritual ascent of deceased souls, involved ritual procedures that paralleled ancient Mesopotamian funerary practices while incorporating elements that reflected later Gnostic influences. The priest's use of specific incantations and ritual gestures during these ceremonies preserved traditional techniques for divine communication that had originally developed within Anunnaki temple complexes, demonstrating remarkable continuity across more than a millennium of cultural and political transformation. The preservation of Mesopotamian astronomical knowledge within Islamic scholarly circles represented another crucial channel through which Anunnaki-related concepts reached medieval audiences. The translation movement that flourished in Baghdad during the 8th and 9th centuries CE brought together scholars from diverse cultural backgrounds who collaborated to render Greek, Persian, and Sanskrit scientific texts into Arabic, while also accessing indigenous Mesopotamian sources that had survived in various forms. The Banu Musa brothers, working under Abbasid patronage during the 9th century, produced translations of astronomical works that preserved Babylonian star names and constellation mythology, ensuring that traditional Anunnaki associations with celestial phenomena would continue to influence Islamic astronomical literature. The great astronomer al-Battani, working in northern Mesopotamia during the late 9th and early 10th centuries, exemplified the sophisticated synthesis of diverse astronomical traditions that characterized Islamic scientific culture. His Zij al-Sabi contains star catalogs that preserved Babylonian stellar nomenclature alongside Greek constellation names and Arabic observational data, creating comprehensive reference works that maintained continuity with ancient traditions while advancing contemporary scientific knowledge. His computational methods for calculating planetary positions incorporated techniques that ultimately derived from Babylonian mathematical astronomy, though adapted and refined through centuries of scholarly development. The Iranian community at ancient Caire represented a remarkable example of direct religious continuity with ancient Mesopotamian traditions, maintaining temple worship and philosophical schools that preserved elements of traditional planetary theology well into the Islamic period. These scholars, who identified themselves as Sabians to gain recognition as a legitimate religious community under Islamic law, maintained sophisticated astronomical and mathematical knowledge that they claimed derived from ancient Mesopotamian wisdom traditions. Their temple complex housed libraries containing texts in multiple languages that preserved traditional knowledge about planetary influences and divine hierarchies, though adapted to conform with monotheistic requirements imposed by Islamic political authority. The influence of Iranian scholars on medieval Islamic intellectual culture extended far beyond their small religious community through their roles as translators, astronomers, and court advisors who brought ancient Mesopotamian knowledge into contact with contemporary scientific and philosophical developments. Thabit ibn Qurra, the most famous Iranian scholar of the 9th century, produced translations of mathematical and astronomical texts that preserved traditional computational methods while also contributing original research that advanced contemporary understanding of planetary motion and mathematical theory. His work on the precession of equinoxes incorporated observational data that derived ultimately from Babylonian astronomical records, demonstrating how ancient knowledge could contribute to contemporary scientific advancement. The preservation of Mesopotamian medical knowledge within Islamic scholarly circles created another channel through which traditional wisdom associated with Anunnaki temple medicine reached medieval audiences. The translation of Greek medical texts that incorporated earlier Mesopotamian pharmaceutical knowledge ensured that traditional remedies and diagnostic techniques would continue to influence medical practice throughout the Islamic world. The works of Hunayn ibn Ishaq and other translators preserved detailed knowledge of plant-based medicines and surgical procedures that had originally developed within temple medical schools, though adapted to serve the needs of Islamic urban populations rather than traditional religious communities. The magical and astrological traditions that emerged within medieval Islamic culture incorporated significant elements derived from ancient Mesopotamian religious practices, though transformed to serve individual rather than communal purposes. The Qayat al-Hakim attributed to the Cordoban scholar Maslama al-Madridi contained detailed instructions for invoking planetary spirits that showed clear relationships to traditional Anunnaki worship, including specific ritual procedures and incantations that preserved ancient terminology and symbolic associations. These magical texts treated traditional deities as powerful spiritual entities that could be contacted through appropriate ritual procedures, maintaining essential elements of ancient religious practice while adapting them to serve private rather than public purposes. The influence of Mesopotamian astrological traditions on medieval Islamic and Christian cultures operated through multiple channels that preserved different aspects of traditional knowledge according to their specific cultural requirements. The Kitab al-Alaf by Abu Mashar al-Baqi incorporated extensive material derived from Babylonian astrological sources, including detailed descriptions of planetary influences and predictive techniques that maintained traditional associations between celestial phenomena and earthly events. His work influenced both Islamic and Latin astrological traditions, ensuring that Mesopotamian concepts would continue to shape medieval understanding of cosmic influences on human affairs. The transmission of Mesopotamian flood narratives through Jewish and Christian literary traditions created additional channels through which Anunnaki-related concepts reached medieval audiences, though significantly transformed to conform with monotheistic theological requirements. The Book of Enoch, composed during the Second Temple period but preserved in various medieval manuscripts, contained detailed accounts of divine beings who descended to earth and taught humanity various arts and sciences, clearly reflecting influence from traditional Anunnaki mythology while adapting these narratives to serve Jewish apocalyptic theology. The text's description of the Watchers and their interactions with humanity preserved structural elements of ancient Mesopotamian divine-human relationships while transforming their theological significance. Medieval Christian chronographic traditions preserved fragments of Mesopotamian historical and mythological narratives through their incorporation of material derived ultimately from Berossus and other Hellenistic sources that had attempted to present Babylonian traditions to Greek audiences. The Chronicle of Michael the Syrian, composed during the 12th century, contained references to antediluvian rulers and divine beings that reflected traditional Mesopotamian king lists and mythological narratives, though interpreted within Christian theological frameworks that emphasize divine providence and human salvation. These chronographic works preserve traditional chronological data and narrative structures, while adapting them to serve Christian historical and theological purposes. The influence of Mesopotamian architectural and artistic traditions on medieval Islamic religious and secular buildings created visual channels through which traditional symbolic associations continued to influence cultural expression. The use of step tower designs in medieval Islamic architecture reflected influence from ancient ziggurat construction, while decorative programs that incorporated astronomical and astrological imagery maintained traditional associations between architectural space and cosmic order. The Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, constructed during the late 7th century, featured decorative elements that showed clear influence from earlier Mesopotamian artistic traditions, including geometric patterns and celestial imagery that preserved traditional symbolic associations while serving new religious purposes. The preservation of Mesopotamian mathematical knowledge within medieval Islamic scholarly circles ensured that computational techniques originally developed for temple administration and astronomical calculation would continue to influence scientific and commercial practice throughout the medieval period. The works of Al-Khwarizmi and other early Islamic mathematicians incorporated methods that derived ultimately from Babylonian mathematical texts, including sophisticated techniques for solving quadratic equations and calculating compound interest that had originally developed to serve temple economic administration. These mathematical traditions maintained continuity with ancient scholarly practices while adapting them to serve the needs of medieval Islamic urban civilization. The influence of Mesopotamian legal traditions on medieval Islamic jurisprudence operated through complex channels that preserved certain procedural and conceptual elements while transforming their theological and social significance. The development of Islamic commercial law incorporated principles that showed clear relationships to earlier Mesopotamian legal traditions, including sophisticated approaches to contract formation, dispute resolution, and commercial partnership that had originally developed within temple-centered economic systems. These legal traditions maintained practical continuity with ancient commercial practices while adapting them to serve the needs of medieval Islamic trading networks. The mystical traditions that emerged within medieval Islamic culture incorporated elements that showed clear relationships to earlier Mesopotamian religious practices, particularly in their approaches to divine communication and spiritual transformation. The works of Sufi authors like Ibn Arabi contained cosmological speculations that reflected influence from traditional Mesopotamian theological concepts, including detailed descriptions of divine hierarchies and cosmic structure that preserved essential elements of ancient religious thought while adapting them to serve Islamic mystical purposes. These mystical traditions maintained continuity with ancient approaches to divine knowledge while transforming their practical and theological applications. The preservation of Mesopotamian agricultural and technical knowledge within medieval Islamic civilization ensured that practical wisdom originally developed within temple-centered economic systems would continue to influence rural and urban life throughout the medieval period. Agricultural manuals produced by Islamic scholars incorporated techniques for irrigation management, crop rotation, and livestock breeding that derived ultimately from Mesopotamian agricultural traditions, though adapted to serve different environmental and social conditions. These technical traditions maintained practical continuity with ancient knowledge while demonstrating their continued relevance for medieval agricultural and urban development. The influence of Mesopotamian musical and liturgical traditions on medieval religious practices created additional channels through which ancient cultural elements reached contemporary audiences, though significantly transformed to serve new religious and social purposes. The development of Islamic liturgical music incorporated modal systems and performance techniques that showed relationships to earlier Mesopotamian temple music, while Christian liturgical traditions in the region preserved certain melodic and rhythmic patterns that reflected continuity with ancient religious practices. These musical traditions maintained aesthetic and practical continuity with ancient cultural forms while adapting them to serve medieval religious and social requirements. The systematic recovery of Anunnaki source materials began with the monumental breakthrough achieved by George Friedrich Grotefend in 1802, when the German philologists successfully deciphered the first cuneiform characters from Old Persian inscriptions at Persepolis. Working with copies of trilingual inscriptions that included Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian versions of the same royal proclamations, Grotefend applied comparative linguistic methods to identify recurring royal names and titles, establishing the foundation for all subsequent cuneiform studies. His initial success with Old Persian provided the key to unlocking Akkadian and eventually Sumerian, opening access to the vast corpus of Mesopotamian literature that had remained silent for over a millennium. The decipherment process accelerated dramatically through the competitive efforts of Henry Rawlinson, who spent years suspended on ropes copying the massive trilingual inscription of Darius I, carved into the cliff face at Behistun in western Iran. Rawlinson's meticulous work during the 1840s provided scholars with extensive bilingual texts that enabled systematic comparison between known Old Persian words and their Akkadian equivalents. His publication of accurate copies of the Behistun inscription in 1851 gave European scholars the extensive parallel texts necessary for establishing grammatical rules and vocabulary lists that would make possible the reading of monolingual Akkadian and Sumerian texts. The British Museum's acquisition of Austin Henry Layard's discoveries from Nineveh transformed European understanding of ancient Mesopotamian civilization and provided the first substantial collection of cuneiform tablets containing mythological and religious texts. Layard's excavations at Kiunjik, the site of ancient Nineveh between 1845 and 1851, uncovered the palace library of Ashurbanipal, containing over 30,000 cuneiform tablets and fragments that represented the most comprehensive collection of Mesopotamian literature ever assembled in antiquity. The library's systematic organization, with texts arranged by subject matter and cross-referenced through detailed catalogs, provided modern scholars with unprecedented access to the full range of Mesopotamian intellectual achievement. George Smith's dramatic announcement in 1872 that he had discovered an account of the biblical flood among the Nineveh tablets created international sensation and demonstrated the immediate relevance of cuneiform studies for understanding ancient history and religious traditions. Smith's identification of the flood narrative within what would later be recognized as the Epic of Gilgamesh marked the first recovery of a complete Anunnaki-related mythological composition, providing concrete evidence for the sophisticated theological and literary traditions that had developed in ancient Mesopotamia. His public lecture to the Society of Biblical Archaeology drew overflow crowds and newspaper coverage that brought cuneiform scholarship to popular attention for the first time. The subsequent identification of multiple flood accounts, including the more complete version preserved in the Atrahasis epic, revealed the central importance of divine judgment narratives within Mesopotamian religious thought and provided scholars with detailed information about Anunnaki theology and cosmic governance. Smith's continued work on the Nineveh tablets yielded additional mythological compositions including creation accounts and divine genealogies that illuminated the complex relationships between different members of the Anunnaki pantheon. His premature death in 1876, while searching for additional flood tablet fragments in Syria, represented a significant loss to the emerging field of Assyriology, but his discoveries had already established the fundamental importance of Mesopotamian literature for understanding ancient religious cultural development. The German excavations at Babylon, initiated by Robert Calderway in 1899 and continuing for 18 years, provided the first systematic archaeological investigation of a major Mesopotamian religious center and yielded extensive architectural and textual evidence for Anunnaki worship practices. Calderway's meticulous documentation of the Ishtar Gate, the processional way, and the foundations of the Great Ziggurat at Temenanke reveal the massive scale of resources devoted to divine service and the sophisticated engineering techniques employed in temple construction. The excavation's recovery of thousands of cuneiform tablets from residential and commercial contexts demonstrated how deeply religious concepts penetrated daily life in Babylonian society. The discovery of the Enuma Elish creation epic among the Babylon tablets provided scholars with the most comprehensive account of Marduk's rise to supreme authority within the Anunnaki hierarchy and revealed the sophisticated theological arguments that Babylonian scholars had developed to justify their city's political dominance. The epic's detailed description of primordial chaos, divine conflict, and cosmic organization offered unprecedented insight into Mesopotamian cosmological thinking while demonstrating the literary sophistication that characterized mature Babylonian religious composition. The text's 7 tablets, each containing approximately 150 lines of carefully structured poetry, represented one of the longest and most complex literary works recovered from ancient Mesopotamia. Leonard Woolley's excavations at UR between 1922 and 1934 revolutionized understanding of early Mesopotamian civilization and provided dramatic evidence for the wealth and sophistication of Sumerian religious institutions. The discovery of the royal cemetery, with its elaborate burial goods and evidence for human sacrifice accompanying royal interments, demonstrated the extraordinary resources that early Mesopotamian societies devoted to ensuring proper relationships between earthly rulers and divine authorities. The cemetery's most spectacular find, the burial of Queen Puabi with her full retinue of attendants, revealed the extent to which Sumerian concepts of divine kingship required elaborate ritual procedures that maintained cosmic order through royal death and resurrection. Woolley's identification of flood deposits at multiple levels within the UR excavation provided archaeological evidence that supported the historical basis for Mesopotamian flood narratives, though the localized nature of these deposits indicated that the Great Flood reflected regional rather than global catastrophic events. The excavation's recovery of votive objects, cylinder seals, and architectural remains from the early dynastic period illuminated the development of Sumerian religious art and temple architecture, while cuneiform tablets from later periods documented the continued importance of Ur as a center for lunar worship and astronomical observation throughout Mesopotamian history. The joint expedition to Nippur, conducted by the University of Pennsylvania and other institutions beginning in 1888, provided the first systematic exploration of Mesopotamia's important religious center and yielded the largest collection of Sumerian literary and religious texts ever discovered. The excavation of the Enlil temple complex revealed the architectural evolution of Mesopotamian religious construction over more than 3 millennia, while the recovery of over 50,000 cuneiform tablets and fragments from the temple archives provided unprecedented documentation of Sumerian religious practices, administrative procedures, and literary traditions. Samuel Noah Kramer's lifelong dedication to translating and interpreting the Nippur tablets revolutionized scholarly understanding of Sumerian civilization and established the fundamental importance of Sumerian religious thought for all subsequent Mesopotamian cultural development. Kramer's identification of numerous firsts in human civilization among the Sumerian texts, including the first literary compositions, the first historical records, and the first systematic theological speculation, demonstrated the foundational role that Sumerian culture had played in human intellectual development. His translation of Sumerian hymns, myths, and epic narratives revealed the sophisticated literary techniques and complex theological concepts that characterized mature Sumerian religious thought. Kramer's work on Sumerian creation myths, including the composition known as the debate between grain and sheep, illuminated the practical concerns that underlay Mesopotamian theological speculation and demonstrated how religious narratives served to explain and justify the agricultural and pastoral activities that sustained urban civilization. His translation of texts describing the sacred marriage between Inanna and Dumuzi provided detailed information about ritual practices that renewed divine authority and ensured agricultural fertility, while his work on Sumerian flood narratives revealed the theological tensions that had led to divine decisions to destroy and recreate human civilization. Thorkild Jacobson's comparative analysis of Mesopotamian religious development provided the theoretical framework that enabled scholars to understand the evolution of Anunnaki theology from its earlier Sumerian origins through its final transformation during the Hellenistic period. Jacobson's identification of distinct phases in Mesopotamian religious thought, from the early democracy of the gods through the later emphasis on individual divine supremacy. Jacobson's detailed analysis of Mesopotamian creation myths revealed the sophisticated political metaphors that underlay apparently simple mythological narratives, demonstrating how stories about divine conflicts and cosmic organization reflected contemporary concerns about earthly governance and social order. His work on the Atrahasis epic illuminated the economic and demographic pressures that had shaped Mesopotamian thinking about divine-human relationships, while his analysis of the Enuma Elish revealed the theological innovations that had enabled Babylonian scholars to adapt traditional religious concepts to serve imperial political requirements. The discovery of the library at Sultan Tepe in southeastern Turkey during excavations conducted by Seton Lloyd and Nuri Gaki in the 1950s provided scholars with additional copies of major Mesopotamian literary works and revealed the extent to which traditional religious texts had been preserved and studied in provincial centers throughout the Assyrian Empire. The library's collection of canonical literary works, including multiple copies of the Gilgamesh epic and various Anunnaki hymns, demonstrated the systematic efforts that Assyrian scholars had made to preserve and standardize Mesopotamian religious literature. The Sultan Tepe tablets included commentaries and scholarly analyses of classical texts that revealed the sophisticated interpretive techniques that ancient scholars had developed for understanding complex mythological and theological concepts. These commentaries provided modern scholars with ancient explanations of obscure references and technical terminology, enabling more accurate translation and interpretation of difficult passages in major literary works. The library's preservation of both canonical texts and scholarly commentaries demonstrated the continuity of intellectual tradition that had maintained Mesopotamian religious and literary culture across multiple centuries of upheaval. French excavations at Mari, conducted by André Perret beginning in 1933, uncovered a major administrative center from the Old Babylonian period and provided extensive documentation of religious practices and political relationships during a crucial period of Mesopotamian history. The palace archives at Mari contained over 25,000 cuneiform tablets that documented diplomatic correspondence, administrative procedures, and religious activities that illuminated the practical operation of divine kingship and temple administration during the early 2nd millennium BCE. The Mari letters included detailed accounts of prophetic activities and divine communication that revealed how Mesopotamian rulers maintained relationships with patron deities and sought divine guidance for political and military decisions. These texts provided concrete evidence for the practical operation of theological concepts that had previously been known primarily through literary and mythological sources, demonstrating how beliefs about divine authority translated into actual political and administrative procedures. The recovery of Akkadian literary texts from various sites throughout Mesopotamia enabled scholars to trace the development of Anunnaki mythology through different periods and regions, revealing both continuity and innovation in religious thought across more than 2 millennia. The identification of multiple versions of major compositions, including various recensions of the Gilgamesh epic and different traditions regarding creation and flood narratives, demonstrated the dynamic character of Mesopotamian religious literature and the ongoing efforts that ancient scholars had made to adapt traditional stories to contemporary concerns. Archaeological investigations at Eridu, conducted by Fouad Safar and Seton Lloyd during the 1940s and 1950s, provided crucial evidence for the earliest development of Mesopotamian religious architecture and confirmed the site's traditional identification as the first city established by the gods. The excavation revealed 17 successive temple levels, dating from the Ubaid period through the Neo-Babylonian era, documenting the continuous religious significance of the site over more than 4 millennia. The earliest temple levels showed sophisticated architectural planning that established design principles later adopted throughout Mesopotamia, while votive objects and architectural features demonstrated the early development of religious concepts that would later be elaborated in complex theological systems. The continuing discovery and publication of cuneiform texts from museum collections and new excavations has provided scholars with an ever-expanding corpus of primary sources for understanding Anunnaki theology and Mesopotamian religious practices. Major text editions, including the ongoing Chicago Assyrian Dictionary Project and the Pennsylvania Sumerian Dictionary, have made possible increasingly sophisticated analysis of religious terminology and theological concepts, while improved understanding of Mesopotamian historical development has enabled more accurate contextualization of religious texts within their original cultural and political settings. Modern archaeological techniques, including satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, and systematic surface survey, have identified hundreds of previously unknown Mesopotamian sites and provided new opportunities for understanding the geographical distribution and regional variation of Anunnaki worship. These technological advances have enabled archaeologists to investigate sites that were previously inaccessible, while minimizing damage to fragile archaeological remains, ensuring that future generations of scholars will have access to well-preserved evidence for understanding ancient Mesopotamian civilization. The integration of archaeological evidence with textual sources has created increasingly sophisticated understanding of how Anunnaki theology developed within specific historical and cultural contexts, while comparative analysis with other ancient Near Eastern religious traditions has illuminated the distinctive characteristics of Mesopotamian thought. This multidisciplinary approach has revealed the complexity and sophistication of ancient Mesopotamian civilization, while demonstrating its fundamental importance for understanding the development of human religious and intellectual culture. The systematic recovery of Mesopotamian textual and archaeological evidence throughout the 19th and 20th centuries established a solid academic foundation for understanding the historical role of the Anunnaki within ancient Near Eastern civilization. Contemporary scholarly consensus recognizes these deities as central figures in the world's earliest urban religious systems, representing sophisticated theological concepts that governed cosmic order, political legitimacy, and social organization throughout 3 millennia of Mesopotamian history. Leading Assyriologists including Jeremy Black, Andrew George, and Mark van der Meerhoop have demonstrated through careful textual analysis and archaeological correlation that the Anunnaki functioned as administrative deities whose authority encompassed both celestial phenomena and terrestrial governance, creating integrated systems of divine kingship that sustained the world's first complex urban societies. Modern academic interpretation emphasizes the Anunnaki's role as patron deities of specific city-states, with individual gods like Enlil at Nippur, Marduk at Babylon, and Inanna at Uruk serving as divine rulers whose earthly temples functioned as comprehensive administrative centers managing agricultural production, craft specialization, and long-distance trade networks. Archaeological evidence from sites like Gursu, Nippur, and Ur reveals the massive economic infrastructure required to support these religious institutions, with temple complexes employing thousands of workers and controlling vast agricultural estates that generated the surplus wealth necessary for monumental construction projects and elaborate ritual cycles. The theological sophistication of Anunnaki worship emerges clearly from comparative analysis of Croatian myths, flood narratives, and divine genealogies preserved in cuneiform literature spanning from early dynastic Sumerian compositions through Neo-Babylonian scholarly commentaries. These texts reveal systematic theological thinking that addressed fundamental questions about cosmic origins, divine authority, human purpose, and moral order through complex mythological narratives that served both religious and political functions within Mesopotamian society. The Atrahasis epic's account of human creation as divine laborers, the Enuma Elish's justification of Babylonian political supremacy through Marduk's cosmic victory, and the various flood narratives' exploration of divine justice demonstrate the intellectual rigor that characterized mature Mesopotamian religious thought. Academic research has also illuminated the historical development of Anunnaki theology through successive periods of political and cultural change, revealing how these religious concepts adapted to serve different social needs, maintaining a central continuity across millennia of historical transformation. The evolution from early Sumerian concepts of divine democracy through later Babylonian emphasis on monarchical divine authority reflects changing political realities, while the integration of foreign deities into traditional Anunnaki hierarchies during periods of cultural contact demonstrates the flexibility that enabled these religious traditions to survive conquest and demographic change. However, the academic understanding of Anunnaki as historical religious phenomena has been overshadowed in popular culture by alternative interpretations that treat these deities as extraterrestrial visitors who influenced early human civilization through advanced technology and genetic manipulation. These theories, popularized primarily through the works of authors like Zecharia Sitchin, Eric von Daniken, and more recently Ancient Aliens television programming, proposed that Sumerian texts describing divine activities should be understood as literal accounts of alien intervention rather than mythological narratives expressing religious and political concepts. Sitchin's translation and interpretation of Sumerian and Akkadian texts, beginning with his 1976 publication The 12th Planet, claimed to reveal evidence for an additional planet called Nibiru, whose inhabitants, the Anunnaki, traveled to Earth approximately 450,000 years ago to mine gold needed for their home planet's atmospheric maintenance. According to Sitchin's interpretation, these extraterrestrial beings genetically modified existing hominid species to create modern humans as a slave labor force, establishing the first human civilizations in Mesopotamia before departing Earth with promises to return during future planetary alignments. Sitchin's theories gained substantial popular following through their presentation in accessible language that promised to reveal hidden truths about human origins while explaining the rapid development of civilization in ancient Mesopotamia. His interpretation of cuneiform texts emphasized passages describing divine beings descending from heaven, teaching humans various technologies, and possessing powers that seem to exceed normal human capabilities. The author's background in economics and journalism, combined with his claimed expertise in ancient languages, lent apparent credibility to his interpretations among audiences lacking specialized knowledge of Mesopotamian studies. The ancient astronaut hypothesis expanded beyond Sitchin's specific interpretations through the work of authors like von Daniken, whose Chariots of the Gods proposed that various ancient monuments and artifacts worldwide provided evidence for extraterrestrial visitation. Von Daniken's approach emphasized visual evidence, including architectural achievements that seemed to exceed ancient technological capabilities, artistic representations that resembled modern aircraft or astronauts, and mythological narratives from multiple cultures describing divine beings with advanced powers and technologies. The popularity of these alternative theories reflects broader cultural fascination with extraterrestrial life and dissatisfaction with conventional academic explanations for the rapid development of human civilization during the Neolithic Revolution. The ancient astronaut hypothesis offers seemingly simple solutions to complex historical questions, while appealing to contemporary scientific concepts about space travel and genetic engineering that make alien intervention appear plausible within modern technological frameworks. Professional Assyriologists and archaeologists have consistently rejected these alternative interpretations through detailed analysis of the linguistic, archaeological, and historical evidence that contradicts extraterrestrial visitation theories. Michael Heiser's comprehensive critique of Sitchin's translations in The Unseen Realm demonstrates numerous errors in cuneiform reading and interpretation that undermine the foundation for ancient astronaut claims, while Irving Finkel's analysis of Mesopotamian flood narratives in The Ark Before Noah reveals the complex literary and theological development that produced these compositions over centuries of cultural evolution. The archaeological record provides no evidence for the advanced technologies that would have been necessary for interplanetary travel during ancient periods, while the gradual development of Mesopotamian civilization through successive cultural phases contradicts claims about sudden technological advancement through alien intervention. Excavations at sites like Tel Essawan, Chagamami, and early Uruk reveal the incremental development of agricultural techniques, craft specialization, and urban organization that produced the complex societies documented in later historical periods. Despite academic rejection, ancient astronaut theories have profoundly influenced popular culture through their incorporation into science fiction literature, television programming, and internet-based alternative history communities. The History Channel's Ancient Aliens series, which has produced over 200 episodes since 2009, presents these theories as legitimate scientific hypotheses worthy of serious consideration, featuring interviews with proponents alongside dramatic reenactments and computer-generated imagery that creates compelling visual narratives supporting extraterrestrial interpretation of ancient evidence. The series format typically presents conventional archaeological and historical evidence alongside alternative interpretations that emphasize unexplained aspects of ancient achievements, creating false equivalences between established scholarly consensus and speculative theories lacking empirical support. This presentation strategy appeals to audiences skeptical of academic authority while satisfying entertainment preferences for dramatic narratives that promise revolutionary revelations about human history and cosmic significance. The influence of Anunnaki concepts on contemporary literature and speculative fiction extends far beyond ancient astronaut theories through their incorporation into fantasy and science fiction narratives that draw inspiration from Mesopotamian mythology while adapting these concepts to serve modern storytelling purposes. Authors like Neil Gaiman in American Gods and Kim Stanley Robinson in The Years of Rice and Salt have incorporated Mesopotamian deities into complex narratives exploring themes of cultural change, religious evolution, and human adaptation to technological advancement. The video game industry has particularly embraced Mesopotamian mythological concepts through games like Assassin's Creed and Civilization that allow players to interact with historical civilizations while incorporating fantastical elements derived from ancient religious traditions. These interactive media create immersive experiences that introduce players to Mesopotamian cultural concepts, while transforming them into entertainment content that may bear little resemblance to their original historical contexts. Contemporary neo-pagan and Reconstructionist religious movements have attempted to revive authentic Mesopotamian religious practices through careful study of cuneiform sources and archaeological evidence, creating modern religious communities that honor traditional Anunnaki while adapting ancient practices to contemporary social and legal contexts. The Mesopotamian Reconstructionist movement, though relatively small, includes practitioners who have learned cuneiform script, studied ancient ritual procedures, and created modern adaptations of traditional ceremonies that maintain theological continuity with ancient practices. These contemporary practitioners face significant challenges in reconstructing authentic ancient religious practices from incomplete textual and archaeological sources, while also adapting traditions developed for ancient urban temple communities to serve the needs of modern individuals and small groups. The absence of continuous traditional transmission requires modern practitioners to rely on scholarly interpretations of ancient sources, creating religious practices that may differ substantially from their ancient predecessors despite sincere attempts at historical accuracy. The Sumerian Mesopotamian Orthodox Temple movement, established by practitioners seeking to create authentic reconstructions of ancient religious traditions, has developed ritual practices based on careful study of cuneiform liturgical texts and archaeological evidence for temple procedures. These groups typically emphasize historical accuracy over contemporary spiritual needs, creating religious practices that prioritize authenticity to ancient sources, even when this creates practical difficulties for modern practitioners. Other contemporary groups have adopted more flexible approaches that honor Mesopotamian deities while incorporating modern spiritual concepts and practices that address contemporary religious needs. These syncretic movements may combine Anunnaki worship with elements from other ancient traditions, modern witchcraft practices, or New Age spirituality, creating religious systems that draw inspiration from Mesopotamian sources while serving the spiritual needs of modern practitioners. The academic study of these contemporary religious movements has revealed the complex relationship between historical scholarship and modern spiritual practice, with Reconstructionist groups serving as both consumers and critics of academic research on ancient Mesopotamian religion. These practitioners often possess sophisticated knowledge of cuneiform sources and archaeological evidence that enables them to engage critically with scholarly interpretations while developing their own understanding of ancient religious concepts and practices. The influence of Anunnaki concepts on contemporary culture extends beyond explicit religious or alternative history movements through their incorporation into broader cultural narratives about human origins, technological development, and cosmic significance. The themes of divine creation, technological advancement, and moral judgment that characterize Mesopotamian mythology continue to resonate with modern audiences through their appearance in science fiction, fantasy literature, and popular philosophy that addresses fundamental questions about human nature and destiny. The digital age has created new opportunities for preserving and disseminating knowledge about Anunnaki traditions through online databases, digital archives, and interactive educational resources that make cuneiform texts and archaeological evidence accessible to global audiences. Projects like the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative and the Open, richly annotated cuneiform corpus provide scholars and interested individuals with access to thousands of primary sources that were previously available only to specialists with access to major research libraries. These digital resources have democratized access to Mesopotamian source materials, while also creating new challenges for distinguishing between accurate scholarly information and alternative interpretations that may lack empirical support. The Internet's capacity for rapid information dissemination has enabled both academic research and pseudoscientific theories to reach global audiences simultaneously, requiring users to develop critical evaluation skills for assessing the reliability of different sources and interpretations. The contemporary legacy of Anunnaki traditions thus encompasses multiple parallel streams of interpretation and application that serve different cultural functions within modern society. Academic scholarship continues to refine understanding of these deities' historical roles within ancient Mesopotamian civilization, while alternative theories provide entertainment and speculative frameworks for understanding human origins. Religious Reconstructionist movements attempt to revive authentic ancient practices, while popular culture adapts Mesopotamian concepts to serve contemporary storytelling and spiritual needs. The enduring appeal of Anunnaki concepts across these diverse contemporary applications demonstrates the fundamental importance of the questions that these ancient traditions addressed regarding cosmic order, divine authority, human purpose, and moral responsibility. Whether approached as historical phenomena worthy of scholarly investigation, extraterrestrial visitors offering solutions to cosmic mysteries, or divine beings deserving contemporary worship, the Anunnaki continue to provide frameworks for understanding humanity's place within larger cosmic and historical contexts. The scholarly consensus regarding Anunnaki as sophisticated theological concepts developed within the world's earliest urban civilizations provides the most reliable foundation for understanding their historical significance and continuing relevance. These deities represented humanity's first systematic attempts to understand cosmic order, political authority, and moral responsibility through complex mythological narratives that integrated religious, political, and practical concerns within comprehensive worldviews that sustained urban civilization for over 3 millennia. The preservation of Anunnaki traditions through cuneiform literature and archaeological remains ensures that these ancient concepts will continue to influence human understanding of religious, political, and cultural development regardless of how contemporary interpreters choose to understand their ultimate significance. The careful work of scholars who have recovered, translated, and interpreted these sources provides future generations with access to humanity's earliest systematic theological and philosophical thinking, demonstrating both the continuity and creativity that have characterized human intellectual development throughout recorded history. The Anunnaki's journey from active deities governing ancient Mesopotamian city-states to subjects of contemporary academic study, popular speculation, and religious revival illustrates the complex processes through which ancient cultural traditions adapt to serve new social and intellectual needs, while maintaining essential continuity with their historical origins. Their continuing presence in modern discourse, whether through scholarly analysis, alternative theories, or contemporary religious practice, testifies to the enduring power of the fundamental questions about human existence, cosmic order, and divine authority that these ancient traditions first systematically addressed over 5,000 years ago.